Winter Lord, starting from the Daily Intelligence. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 26: Fertilizer and Seeds. As the frost giant's corpse was dragged away, the stench of blood on the battlefield finally began to dissipate. But for Lewis, the true objective of this operation had only just begun: mining magic marrow, as the core material for explosive alchemy, was extremely rare. Even in the entire Northern Territory, and even in the entire Ironblood Empire, such deposits were few and far between. Fortunately, this deposit was buried very deep, so it had remained undiscovered until now, otherwise Lewis wouldn't have had the chance. Moreover, without the guidance of the Daily Intelligence system, Lewis would never have found it. Knights guarded the outer perimeter, while a group of civilians, armed with pickaxes, gloves, and simple protective gear, slowly entered the mining area and began to cautiously mine. Shovelful after shovelful of rubble was dug away, and with a crisp clang, a corner of the deep purple crystal hidden beneath the ore layer was finally revealed. It was an ore that emitted a faint glow and exuded mysterious energy fluctuations. Take a small portion first, and adjust the magic's oil formula according to Hilco's suggestion, Lewis ordered. The rest will be sealed away for now. He was not in a hurry to order large-scale mining. After all, this requires specialized personnel, mine tunnel reinforcement, mining technology, and gold refining are all tasks that cannot be easily solved. He had specifically mentioned this need in a letter he had sent to his father. If his father was willing to send someone to assist, that would be ideal. Otherwise, Lewis would have to find a way to recruit experienced craftsmen from outside. The spring sun shone on the farmland of Red Tide Territory, a gentle breeze carrying the fresh scent of new buds. Lewis stood on high ground, overlooking this land gradually regaining its vitality. A few weeks ago, this was a barren field newly planted. Now, rye had sprouted, potato leaves were emerging from the ground, and turnip seedlings swayed gently in the wind. It seems this year's harvest shouldn't be too bad. A satisfied smile appeared on his lips. Just then, hurried footsteps came from afar. Mick came running, a little uneasy. Although he had successfully proposed, he hadn't yet formally informed the Lord. As a former slave, Mick still harbored a certain fear of his master. Although he was now a free man, he still believed that marriage required the master's approval. What if Lewis was unwilling? What if he disapproved? These thoughts swirled in Mick's mind, making his steps heavier than usual. However, before he could speak, Lewis smiled faintly and said loudly, "Mick, congratulations on your successful proposal." Mick was completely stunned. He hadn't even said anything. How did the Lord know? Shock, fear, disbelief, various emotions surged within him, and he even subconsciously wanted to kneel down. However, a fair hand supported him. Lewis frowned, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Mick, you are now the agricultural steward, don't kneel down so easily." Mick suddenly came to his senses, his eyes slightly reddening, his lips moving as if he wanted to say something. But he was interrupted by a gift Lewis handed him. It was 2 smoked fish, tied together with a thin string, even with a crooked bow. Mick was stunned. "This is a congratulatory gift," Lewis said calmly. "Although I'm a bit short on cash lately, I still felt I should give a small gift." Mick clutched the gift tightly, his lips trembling. Finally, he couldn't hold back his tears, which fell in a steady stream. He had never imagined that he would receive such a blessing from the Lord. He had thought he would have to carefully request the Lord's permission, perhaps be reprimanded, or even be asked to pay some price. "Don't cry," Lewis patted Mick's shoulder. "Isn't this a good thing?" Mick sniffed, nodding frantically, trying to calm himself down. "All right, calm down. I have important business to discuss with you." Hearing this, Mick took a deep breath, wiped away his tears, and stood up straight. "Please give your orders." Lewis tilted his head slightly, gesturing for him to look behind him. Mick instinctively followed his gaze, then his eyes widened suddenly, and he gasped. 4 enormous corpses lay dead beside the farmland, their mangled bodies riddled with holes, the frost-covered skin beginning to melt, revealing dark blue flesh. These, such huge corpses, Mick's Adam's apple bobbed, and it took him a long time to find his voice. "Don't just stand there, I need you to process these corpses into fertilizer," Lewis said with a smile. Fertilizer? Mick was so shocked he almost bit his tongue. He'd never heard of using the corpses of frost giants as fertilizer. Lewis's tone, however, carried a certain nonchalance. The muscles of frost giants are rich in minerals. If used properly, they might bring miraculous benefits to the crops. Mick's lips twitched, but his mind was already racing, considering how to deal with these 4 fertilizer mountains. But before his shock had completely subsided, Lewis's next words made him tense again. "And this?" Lewis took a small cloth bag from his pocket and solemnly handed it to Mick. The bag contained half of the frostblood crimson berry seeds. Because they were so precious, Lewis dared not risk cultivating them and could only tentatively plant a portion first. The reason he gave them to Mick was because the intelligence system had stated that Mick possessed astonishing planting talent. Lewis believed that if he taught him the planting methods, he would at least grow them several times better than himself. Mick quickly reached out and took the bag, carefully opening it to find what appeared to be ordinary fruit seeds. This is frostblood crimson berry seeds," Lewis said without further explanation. "Anyway, they are extremely precious. One seed is worth several hundred gold coins." Mick's eyes widened, his breathing becoming rapid. One seed could buy hundreds of slaves like himself. I'm supposed to handle it." Mick's hands trembled slightly, afraid he might accidentally destroy these precious seeds. Lewis nodded and said, "These seeds are very rare and must be carefully cultivated. If you have any problems, feel free to contact me. I've already had someone research a suitable magic oil formula, but it will take time. So your current task is to bury these seeds in ice to activate them." Okay. Mick quickly and carefully held the seeds. "I will take good care of them and will not let them suffer any damage." Just then, a guard ran over and said to Lewis, "Sir, the girl we rescued earlier has woken up." Chapter 27. Sif awakens. Consciousness oscillated between chaos and reality, like sinking into the deep sea and being slowly pulled back to the surface. Sif slowly opened her eyes, her blurred vision gradually clearing. Before her was an unfamiliar wooden ceiling, the air thick with a faint scent of smoke. Her body was wrapped in warm blankets, her skin clearly feeling the comforting warmth. Instinctively, she quickly scanned her surroundings. It was a wooden hut, the walls and beams simple yet clean, with a few simple wooden tables and chairs, and a fireplace burning warmly. Fortunately, there were no chains binding her, nor any obvious weapons. Sif tried to turn over, but she felt her body wouldn't obey her commands. She was so weak that even the slightest movement was incredibly difficult. Oh no! This body was completely immobile. This made her heart sink. Then, a flood of tragic memories rushed back. The destruction of the Cold Moon tribe. Her brothers, sisters, and parents all died tragically because of betrayal. Her last brother sacrificed himself to cover her escape, dying alongside the enemy. She closed her eyes, grief overwhelming her, as if a boulder weighed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "At least I'm alive, I still have a chance for revenge," she gritted her teeth, fighting back the stinging tears in her eyes, trying to calm herself. Just then, the wooden door creaked open. Sif opened her eyes abruptly, looking warily into the doorway. She had expected to see unfamiliar soldiers, nobles, or the murderers who had slaughtered her people. Instead, a thin, middle-aged woman entered, appearing to be in her 40s, her face wrinkled. She wore simple cotton clothes and carried a tray with a bowl of porridge and a cup of warm water, the rising steam carrying a faint aroma of food. Seeing Sif awake, the woman's eyes lit up with joy. "Oh dear, you're finally awake. You're lucky to be alive, child." The middle-aged woman gently lifted Sif's upper body, letting her lean against the soft pillows. She then picked up a cup of warm water and gently brought it to her lips, saying in a gentle tone, "Drink some water first, soothe your throat. You've been unconscious for several days." After hesitating for a moment, Sif finally opened her mouth slightly, allowing the woman to bring the rim of the cup to her lips. The warm water slowly flowed into her mouth, finally easing the burning sensation in her throat. Sif couldn't help but swallow gently, her consciousness gradually clearing with the soothing water. "Slowly, don't rush," the woman said with a hint of heartache. "Poor child, you must have suffered a lot." Sif's eyelashes trembled slightly, a dark emotion flashing in her eyes, but she didn't respond to the woman's words. "If it weren't for the Lord sending people to rescue you, you would probably have been carried off by wild beasts." The woman patted her back lightly as she began to mutter to herself. Hearing this, Sif lowered her eyes slightly, her fingers tightening subtly. The Lord? A nobleman from the south. A sense of vigilance rose in her heart, but her face remained silent. The woman, oblivious to her inner turmoil, continued her rambling. Don't be afraid. Our Lord, though young, is a remarkable man, kind-hearted and compassionate, unable to bear seeing the pitiful. You don't know, do you? He even saves wounded slaves. We refugees have all received much care from him. She spoke lightly, but Sif's unease grew. She had actually been taken in by the nobles of the southern barbarians. From childhood, she had heard countless rumors about the empire. They were cunning invaders, each one cold-blooded and ruthless, fond of deceiving the weak with lies before mercilessly devouring everything. And now she had fallen into the hands of such people, and Sif's unease intensified. First and foremost, she absolutely could not let them know her true identity. Although her family was now destroyed, her status as the former princess of the Cold Moon tribe still held immense value. To those in power, she was a useful political bargaining chip. She might even be sent to the imperial court, becoming a plaything of some nobleman. Sif could not accept such a fate. So, what should she do now? Her fingers clenched slightly, her heart pounding with anxiety. Run away? Sif quickly rejected the idea. She was completely immobilized, and besides, she knew nothing about the terrain. A hasty escape would either result in her death on the way or being caught, making her situation even worse. Feign compliance? Perhaps that was an option. She could pretend to obey, secretly observe everything, and then look for a suitable opportunity to escape. But this required extreme caution. She couldn't reveal her identity, nor could she let the other party detect her intention to escape. Most importantly, she had to figure out what kind of person this lord really was. If he was truly a kind-hearted person, as the middle-aged woman had said, then perhaps she would have some breathing room. But if he was only outwardly benevolent but inwardly ruthless, then she had to prepare for the worst. In any case, she couldn't just sit and wait to die. As she was lost in thought, footsteps suddenly sounded outside the door, accompanied by a guard's announcement, "The Lord has arrived." Sif's body tensed instinctively, her fingers gripping the blankets tightly, and she held her breath. She had mentally prepared herself to face a lecherous, fleshy-faced imperial nobleman reeking of strong spices. She had even rehearsed the impending scenario countless times in her mind. If he humiliated her, she would feign submission and wait for a chance to escape. However, when the door opened, reality completely surprised her. Entering was a handsome young man with dark hair. He looked to be in his early 20s, tall and well-dressed, neither excessively luxurious nor shabby. Everything was just right. He didn't have the overpowering smell of spices, nor ostentatious gold jewelry, nor an aura of cruelty or bloodlust. Instead, he possessed a clean and crisp air. His eyes scrutinized, but not with condescending contempt. There was even a hint of gentleness in them. Sif froze for a moment. This was a nobleman from the iron-blooded empire? This was completely different from what she had been taught since childhood. In her mind, the imperial nobles were either obese, greedy gluttons or ruthless butchers, bloodthirsty, arrogant, and regarding the northern barbarians as beasts. But this young man before her didn't seem like that at all. However, she quickly regained her composure, alarm bells ringing in her mind. She couldn't be deceived by appearances. This man might just be better at disguising himself than other southern barbarians. His appearance was clean, his manner elegant, but that didn't mean he lacked ambition or scheming. Therefore, she had to be even more careful. Sif suppressed her doubts, lowered her eyelids, and silently observed his every move. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28 White-haired beautiful girl. Silence filled the room, broken only by the soft crackling of the burning wood in the fireplace. Louis stood by the bed, gazing at the frail girl before him. Her skin was paler than that of the Imperials, with a cool hue characteristic of the North. Her short, silver-white hair was slightly disheveled, and her deep blue eyes held an air of mystery. Though slender, her muscular physique was accentuated by taut muscles beneath her skin, like a cheetah poised to pounce. Even in her predicament, her gaze remained neither humble nor arrogant, carrying a barely perceptible wariness. Louis asked, "What's your name?" Sif looked at him quietly, offering no answer. "Where did you come from?" Still silence. "Where are you going?" The firelight reflected on the girl's calm, expressionless face, but she seemed not to hear him, remaining silent. A kind old woman nearby sighed and gently patted Sif's hand. Her voice held a hint of pity. "Poor child, don't be afraid, we are all good people here. The Lord saved you, he won't harm you." Sif's mind, however, was racing. She knew very well that if she fabricated an identity, she would likely be exposed. Trying to evade the questions might only arouse suspicion. The best solution she could think of was to play dumb and feign ignorance. Not wanting to reveal her identity, she simply went along with it and remained silent. Unexpectedly, the other party's reaction was more understanding than she had imagined. Lewis pretended to look at her thoughtfully. After a moment, seemingly reaching a conclusion, he said calmly, "Looks like you've lost your memory." Sif was stunned, not expecting Lewis to offer such an explanation. She lowered her eyes slightly, neither confirming nor denying, implicitly accepting the explanation. Lewis looked at her long, silver-white hair and said casually, "Since you've lost your memory, then stay for now." Then, after a moment's thought, a cryptic smile appeared on his lips. "Your hair is white, so from now on, we'll call you Little White." Instantly, Sif's pupils contracted, and anger surged within her. Little White. She was the princess of the Cold Moon tribe, raised with royal education, taught by her father to bear noble blood and shoulder the future of the tribe. And now, a southern barbarian had casually given her a name like a pet. Her nails dug deep into her palms as she suppressed her anger. Sif told herself she couldn't reveal her emotions, couldn't let him discover her true identity. So she remained silent, clenching her teeth, not uttering a word. But she had already secretly made a mental note of this southern barbarian who had insulted her. "Can you read?" Lewis asked casually, as if it were just a casual remark. Sif, suppressing her anger, nodded subconsciously. But almost simultaneously, she realized she had made a mistake. The reaction was too quick, too natural. In the Cold Moon tribe, only the noble class had the opportunity to learn the language and writing of the Southerners. Therefore, although Sif's father deeply hated Southerners, he still hired a Southern teacher to instruct her in language and writing. Now, this had become a possible flaw that could betray her identity. Sif glanced up, secretly observing Lewis's expression, trying to determine if he had already noticed anything. Lewis, seemingly oblivious to her mistake, nodded thoughtfully. "Then you'll be my secretary from now on." Secretary? Sif didn't immediately understand, as she'd never heard the term before. Lewis explained, "It'll be helping me remember things and handle miscellaneous tasks. Don't worry, it's nothing difficult, and you won't be doing anything dangerous." Sif lowered her eyes, lost in thought. A secretary didn't sound like a slave or prisoner, nor did it seem like a dangerous job. At least it was much better than being imprisoned, tortured, or even executed. And she seemed to have no better choice. So Sif nodded slightly, tacitly accepting the arrangement. This wasn't submission, but rather forbearance, Sif told herself. Seeing this, Lewis's lips curled slightly, then he stood up. "You just woke up, rest well first, we'll talk about it when you've recovered." He didn't say anything more, and walked towards the door. Sif watched Lewis's retreating figure, her fingers tightening slightly on the bedding, her eyes filled with complex emotions. The man didn't show obvious malice, but he wasn't exactly benevolent either. What was he thinking? She couldn't judge for a moment, nor dared to draw any conclusions. But one thing she was very clear about was that her ultimate goal would not change: survive, and then take revenge. On the other side, Lewis walked out of the room, a faint smile playing on his lips, seemingly in a good mood. Having Sif as his secretary was indeed a good idea. Lewis didn't care that Sif was hiding her identity. He had already learned a rough idea of Sif's identity through the intelligence system. Who she was didn't matter, what mattered was that she was nothing now. Even if he had the opportunity to use Sif's identity later, he wouldn't need her consent. And for now, as long as Sif was in his territory, under his control, that was enough. Lewis even found Sif's deliberate concealment somewhat endearing. Like a stray dog that had been taken in, afraid to bark, but with eyes constantly alert, tail slightly tucked between its legs. Unwilling to get close, yet afraid to make any rash moves, lest he be slaughtered and eaten. As for her ability to write, that was an unexpected bonus. This greatly reduced Hilco's workload, finally freeing him from daily complaints about being overwhelmed by paperwork. And having a beautiful white-haired girl by his side would surely improve his work mood, right? He strode forward cheerfully, turning to the artisan's workshop to discuss the castle construction with Mike. Construction in Red Tide territory was in full swing. Thanks to the ease of building semi-subterranean communal dwellings and the hard work of the slaves, rows of neat houses rose from the ground, and the semi-subterranean communal dwellings were complete. It could be called a miracle in the history of northern construction. Now, knights each had their own independent rooms, soldiers 2 to a room, free citizens 3 to a room, slaves 6 to a room, and married households could even apply for independent residences. Such a housing arrangement was a tremendous blessing in the barren northern territories. At least when winter came, no one would be homeless and freeze to death in the snow. This was almost unimaginable in other territories, but under Louis's rule, it had all become a reality. However, merely settling the people was far from enough. Now that the foundation of the Red Tide territory has been gradually consolidated, it is time to allocate half of the craftsmen and laborers to begin building a true lord's castle. Chapter 29 Yugong Mike. The workshop reeked of sweat, and the sounds of hammering echoed through the air. Craftsmen of all kinds worked diligently and efficiently at their respective posts. Even the apprentices were immersed in the busy work. The entire workshop was like a precisely functioning machine, every link working in close coordination. The industrial prototype of Red Tide territory was quietly taking shape. Louis watched all this and nodded in satisfaction. This time, he had a clear objective, heading straight to the depths of the workshop to find the craftsman's leader, Mike. Mike was hammering a wooden board, pretending to be busy to cover up the fact that he had just been slacking off. When Louis approached, he put down his tools, revealing an excited expression. "Lord, what brings you here? It's time to build a castle." Louis got straight to the point, without any preamble. Build a castle. Mike was instantly excited. He had been waiting for this day for a long time. "Lord, give me 50 years. I will definitely build you the largest and most magnificent castle in the Ironblood Empire in the north. 50 years? I'm already 70 years old. You'll probably be in your coffin by then." Louis was speechless. He suspected Mike was a spectacle enthusiast. Mike laughed heartily. "My apprentice dies. I build it. My apprentice dies. My grand apprentice builds it." Louis's lips twitched slightly, unable to resist retorting, "Are you the foolish old man? Your descendants will never end." Mike scratched his head. "Who is the foolish old man?" Louis waved his hand helplessly. "It's not important. Let's be realistic. We don't have much time. The castle needs to be built as quickly as possible. It must be built fast, and it must be functional, with defense being paramount." He then pulled a castle design he had drawn from his pocket and handed it to Mike. The design detailed the functions of each area of the castle. The castle must balance defensive effectiveness, functional integration, and aesthetics, but defense is the most important. 80% of the focus should be on defense, and 20% on habitability. "We must never sacrifice defense for comfort," Louis explained, pointing to the detailed annotations. Mike glanced at the blueprints, his expression subtle, and finally said with difficulty, "My lord, this design is excellent, but this kind of stone fortress will take at least 10 years. At this complexity, it might not even be completed in 30 or 40 years. Louis was dumbfounded. 10 years? 30 or 40 years? He thought he had considered the efficiency aspects very thoroughly, but he found his plan to be completely impractical. He had originally planned to build a sufficiently sturdy castle as quickly as possible, but it turned out that even 30 or 40 years wouldn't be enough. Mike looked at him, his smile somewhat awkward. "To be honest, with our technology and the number of workers, achieving that level would be a long shot." Louis frowned, calculating in his mind. The Crimson Tide territory had already reached a certain size, but it remained incredibly vulnerable to external threats. The castle wasn't just about luxurious living, it was a bulwark for survival. Currently, the Frost Moon tribe was in turmoil, but once unified, they would definitely move south. Moreover, the northern border wasn't just threatened by this, there were also the glacier giants further north, and the former Snow Kingdom rebels, among other crises. These crises were like a speeding dump truck hurtling towards Red Tide territory. Louis didn't have time to wait another 10 or 30 years. He couldn't possibly wait until he was old to move into his ideal castle. He changed his question, asking, "Is there a faster alternative?" Mike hesitated for a moment, then stammered, well. He looked at the hammer in his hand, then at the busy craftsmen around him. seemingly trying to find a reasonable solution, but ultimately could only shake his head helplessly. "I haven't been to school. I don't have any innovative ideas," Mike said with a wry smile. Lewis sighed helplessly and waved his hand. "Forget it, I'll figure it out myself." After saying that, Lewis closed his eyes and began to recall the classic architectural forms he had seen in his previous life. The high walls of castles, the sturdiness of watchtowers, the imposing weight of fortresses, each building cycled through his mind, but all of these required a great deal of time and resources to build. "Not good enough, not fast enough," he murmured. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Lewis's mind, like a lightning bolt piercing the silence of darkness. "Too low," he blurted out. Too low. He remembered the kind of architecture from his hometown in his previous life. They were unique dwellings built by the Hakka people to escape war, surrounded by walls on all four sides, sturdy and durable, with a large capacity to hold hundreds of people. They were hailed as Oriental ancient castles. Most importantly, Tula were quick to build. "Yes, that's what I need." He quickly picked up a pen and began rapidly modifying the blueprints, changing the originally complex castle design into a large cylindrical structure. Mike stood to the side, frowning. "This is bare, it's not aesthetically pleasing at all." Lewis rolled his eyes. "Aesthetics? What use is aesthetics? Practicality is most important. It must be able to block enemies and accommodate everyone, that's the key." He pointed his pen at the blueprints and explained, "Look, this circular structure can disperse external pressure to the greatest extent, providing strong defense. And using earthen building materials, it's low cost and fast, requiring very little time and resources." Mike helplessly touched his hair and began to carefully observe Lewis's castle design. But he quickly realized that Lewis was indeed right. Although this earthen building looks simple and rugged, it is undoubtedly a practical and efficient choice. Lewis stood in the center of the craftsman's workshop, waving blueprints in his hand, and began explaining his construction plans to the craftsman one by one. "First, the location is very important," he said, pointing to a marked spot on the blueprints. "The castle should ideally be near a hot spring, but not too hot. The geothermal heat from the hot springs will provide natural heating for the building. Furthermore, in winter, we can pipe hot spring water under the floor, which will have its own heat, keeping the floor warm in winter, like a natural heated floor. This way, we won't have to worry about the cold in winter." The craftsman's eyes widened. They had never imagined such a solution. Seeing their reaction, Lewis smiled smugly and continued, "Then comes the outer defensive wall. We'll use a 1-meter thick stone wall to form a circular structure, plus hot spring clay to create the central earthen wall. This will be strong enough and highly defensive. The inner circle will be a wooden frame dwelling, with giant logs as pillars and beams for reinforcement, divided into multiple living areas. The first floor will be used for storage, and the second, third, and fourth floors will be for living. The wooden stairs will be made from plain tree trunks, simple and practical." He drew a simple internal structure on the blueprints. Chapter 30: A Letter from the North. Lewis continued explaining his design concept. "For defense, the main gate will be covered with thick iron plates, which will not only protect against slashing but also fire attacks. Arrow slits can be designed at the top of the stone walls, allowing our archers to respond from inside at any time. Boiling oil outlets will be hidden in the roof. Once the enemy gets close to climb, hot oil can be poured on them to scald them to death. These underhanded tricks will greatly enhance the defensive capabilities of the earthen building." Finally, he patted the blueprints and summarized, "Stones around the perimeter, mud plastered with turf, a wooden frame for the interior, hot spring water as a heater, the earthen castle is done." The craftsmen were dumbfounded, completely astonished by the simple yet practical design. However, what surprised them even more was that Lewis could design such a complete set of buildings in such a short time. Several people couldn't help but whisper in admiration, "Lord, you're a genius." Mike pondered for a moment, then slowly nodded. "It's indeed feasible. The construction period might be shortened to within 6 months, or even faster. But I can't guarantee success, because this is something new, unprecedented. You research the specific techniques and do your best." Lewis patted him on the shoulder. Hearing Lewis's words, the craftsmen began to discuss in hushed tones, an atmosphere of excitement spreading through the workshop. If this bold plan succeeded, it would not only bring stronger defenses to the Red Tide territory but also further enhance its prestige in the north. Thus, the Red Tide territory's earthen building project officially began. As usual, Duke Calvin got up and did his favorite exercise, stretching his muscles. Then he washed up, changed his clothes, and finally sat in his study, beginning to review the mountain of letters. Most of the letters were about mundane matters, land management, economic allocation, noble marriages, conflict mediation. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a particular letter. The sender was Louis Calvin. The name made Duke Calvin pause slightly, a name that seemed vaguely familiar. After a moment's thought, he finally remembered. Louis was his 8th son, the one whose mother had died young and who was considered poorly gifted. A few months ago, to appease the emperor's decree for expansion, he had casually abandoned him in the northern frontier. Sigh, too many children, even remembering them all is difficult, Duke Calvin sighed, referring to Versailles. He now had 10 daughters and 12 sons, as well as 2 pregnant concubines. In raising children, he always adhered to a strategy of quantity over quality. As long as he had enough, some would inevitably succeed. And this approach had indeed worked. For example, his eldest son, Gaius, was now the vice commander of the Imperial Guard, the Dragonblood Knights. He was likely to be the next Calvin patriarch. The Duke looked at the envelope bearing the Calvin family crest, a hint of impatience in his heart. This was probably a letter begging to return to the south. But since it had already arrived, he might as well take a look. The letter began with Louis simply reporting his safe arrival in his northern territory and that everything was running smoothly. He then mentioned a surprising discovery. Louis had found a large quantity of cold iron ore within his territory, and even discovered the extremely rare magic marrow ore. Duke Calvin chuckled upon reading this. Magic marrow ore was only found in large quantities in the Emerald Federation, while the Ironblood Empire had very few. He thought Louis had simply gotten incredibly lucky and didn't believe the boy had discovered such valuable resources by chance. Regardless, the value of the territory had indeed increased significantly, making it worthwhile to invest more resources in its development. However, the letter's next part surprised Duke Calvin even more. He had expected Louis to request fine food, wine, and beautiful women, things for indulging in a luxurious lifestyle. But Louis's requests were completely different from what the Duke had anticipated. He made a series of practical and useful requests: construction and mining artisans to improve the territory's infrastructure, especially mining and castle construction. Secondly, he requested grain, various seeds, and livestock. Finally, the letter specifically mentioned bloodstone, a mysterious mineral that could test whether someone possessed the potential to become a knight. "It seems this lad is much smarter than I thought," the Duke murmured, raising an eyebrow and a flicker of interest in his almost forgotten son. After reading the letter, Duke Calvin tapped the table thoughtfully. Recent troubles surfaced in his mind. The emperor's recent measures against the old nobility had become increasingly harsh, weakening the power of the 8 great families one by one. Meanwhile, new nobles were emerging, intensifying the struggle for power. The political landscape of the Ironblood Empire was now incredibly complex, and even he himself was beginning to feel unprecedented pressure. Perhaps expanding into the north was a way out, he thought. Of course, it was impossible for him to pour large amounts of support into the north. But using Louis's territory to sow a seed in the north was a viable option. Having understood all this, Duke Calvin ordered his guards, "Bring Bradley here." A moment later, an old butler entered the study. Duke Calvin gestured for him to sit, then picked up the letter from Louis from the table and slowly placed it in front of Bradley. "This is a letter from Louis." Duke Calvin paused slightly. "He's requesting personnel and resources from me. After some consideration, I've decided to give him some support." Bradley nodded seriously, picked up the letter, and quickly read it. Duke Calvin continued, "You'll go with a team to the north to investigate the specifics of the magic mine and see if what Louis said is true or false. And you understand, the magic mine can't be easily exposed." "Yes, Your Grace," Bradley replied, without a hint of complaint about being sent to that god-forsaken place. "In addition, I will give him some limited support. I will assign several experienced craftsmen and architects to help him improve the town's construction. A small squad of knights will also be sent to help Louis increase his fighting strength, along with some funds, food, tools, seeds, and livestock, etc. These aren't many things. Consider it giving him an opportunity." Duke Calvin considered for a moment, then continued, "If he can govern the territory well, the family will increase its investment. If he shows any incompetence, the family will immediately withdraw all support. Bradley, you are responsible for secret surveillance to ensure everything is under control. Understood. The old butler Bradley replied with a slight bow. The Duke stood up, slowly walked to the window, and gazed north. Lewis, I hope you won't disappoint me, he said softly. Chapter 31 Enemy Attack. Bradley acted with remarkable speed. Upon receiving the Duke's orders, he began preparations for the journey to the north without hesitation. In less than a day, he led an elite force on the expedition. The force consisted of 3 elite knights, 10 regular knights, and 30 apprentice knights. In addition, there were dozens of experienced craftsmen skilled in construction, mining, and metallurgy. Supplies were equally abundant. Dozens of carts were fully loaded with grain, wheat flour, dried meat, and pickled vegetables, ensuring they could survive even the harshest conditions in the north. There were also neatly packed seeds of various cold-resistant crops and dozens of livestock suitable for the north, black-horned cattle, cold-weather sheep, and hardy war horses, all carefully selected to adapt to the harsh, snow-covered environment. There was also the bloodstone and 3,000 gold coins. The caravan departed the winter southern province, embarking on the long journey to the Red Tide territory in the north. Lewis's morning was as usual. Upon waking, he habitually opened the daily intelligence system. The screen displayed today's intelligence, which he quickly scanned. Daily intelligence update complete. 1. Under Duke Calvin's orders, Bradley led a supply convoy to Red Tide territory. 2. Tomorrow night, Baron John Harvey, the pioneer, will be robbed by bandits while passing through Green Rock Rift. 3. Serf Romeo and native Juliet tasted forbidden fruit in the fields. The first piece of intelligence made Lewis's eyes light up. He hadn't expected his letter to Old Deng to have such an effect, drawing his attention to the potential of Red Tide territory and actually yielding gold coins. Lewis stared at the name in the message. Bradley. The name echoed in his mind for a moment. He was one of the Calvin family's old stewards, highly respected within the family, practically a core figure in family affairs. Lewis hadn't expected Duke Calvin to send him this time, indicating the Duke highly valued Red Tide territory. As for the specific supplies that would be brought, the intelligence report didn't provide details, but it seemed there would be a considerable amount. Moreover, Bradley's arrival would help him handle some of the territory's trivial matters, making his life much easier. Then, he saw the second intelligence report. This made Lewis frown slightly, even somewhat shocked. He knew Yorn, one of the original owner's few friends in this new world. In the Iron Blood Empire, the offspring of powerful families all underwent training in the capital. The original owner, due to his poor talent, was ostracized by other noble children, while Yorn, because of his clumsiness, was often ridiculed. Thus, the two often hung out together. Yorn always silently followed behind him, calling him boss, the pioneer baron. Lewis's gaze unconsciously lingered on these words, somewhat puzzled. Yorn's father, Earl Harvey, was a newly risen nobleman in recent years. Although the family was very wealthy, he only had 2 children. According to the Northern Frontier Expansion Order, Yorn didn't need to come to such a harsh place as the North to expand his territory. However, the intelligence report showed that he was actually called the Pioneer Baron, which confused Lewis. The news of Yorn's attack unsettled him. Resources were scarce in the north, and bandits were rampant. Although Yorn was certainly protected by knights, it wasn't impossible for him to be captured or killed. For both personal and practical reasons, he had to go to Green Rock Rift to personally rescue Yorn. After all, he was one of his few remaining friends. As for the third point, Lewis felt a little helpless. These young people were really reckless, daring to make a mistake in the fields. But as the Lord, he didn't intend to get involved. A larger population in Red Tide territory would be more beneficial to him. After reviewing all the intelligence for the day, Lewis summoned Lambert and directly ordered, "Assemble the knights and head to Green Rock Rift." Lambert didn't ask any questions, deftly patting his breastplate. "Understood, I will prepare immediately." Before he finished speaking, he had already turned and quickly walked outside to gather his men. The night wind in Green Rock Rift was biting, crackling the campfire, its light illuminating a round face. John Harvey, wrapped in a mink cloak, held a bowl of steaming porridge. He looked like a fluffy, fat cat, and as he sipped his soup, he boasted, "You know what? Back in the capital, those noble scions, relying on their family's power and influence, were utterly lawless, bullying men and women. And what happened? Didn't Lewis and I take care of them?" Jorn wiped the soup from his mouth with his sleeve, speaking smugly. "That day, the two of us took on a whole small group of nobles, at least a dozen people. Lewis punched one of them to the ground, and I wasn't going to be outdone. I just grabbed the chair and smashed it down, scaring them half to death. Of course, Lewis was fierce, but it was mainly me. Without me, he wouldn't have lasted that long. Yes, sir, you are incredibly brave, several knights sang along, tacitly refraining from exposing Jorn's exaggeration. Having known him for a long time, they were used to Jorn's clumsy attempts to glorify himself. They maintained respectful smiles, but their hearts were filled with uncertainty. Could this lord truly lead them to a foothold in the north? They had sensed along the way that Jorn had little understanding of the realities of conquering territory. He seemed to believe that with just over 600 men and a surge of passion, they could carve out a place for themselves in the north. But they knew the environment in the north was far more brutal than the noble struggles of the south. Bravery and courage alone wouldn't be enough to survive. And Jorn, as the lord of this force, seemed utterly unsuspecting. He even casually gave orders for patrols before continuing to laugh and boast about his heroic deeds. In his mind, with dozens of knights and nearly 100 soldiers under his command, how could they possibly encounter trouble? Just then, several whooshing sounds pierced the silence. Dozens of crossbow bolts rained down from both sides of the ravine's cliffs, their arrowheads spinning in the air, carrying a chilling killing intent, precisely aimed at the unsuspecting Jorn's group. Thud! A soldier, his throat pierced, collapsed, blood splattering onto the stones by the campfire, instantly staining the area crimson. Immediately afterward, a rapid, frantic rush erupted as desperados in white cloaks leaped from the cliffs on either side, like phantoms in the night, swiftly storming the camp. Enemy attack! The piercing cry had barely escaped when a desperado pounced on the shouting soldier like a cheetah, his dagger precisely slicing open his throat. Blood spurted, the scream abruptly cut short. Chaos descended upon the camp. Chapter 32 Rescue. Kill them all. Seize the goods, the bandit leader roared, brandishing his long sword. His men unleashed their fighting spirit, charging forward with high morale. The slaves and serfs screamed in terror, dropping their rations and tools as they scattered and fled. The soldiers frantically drew their weapons, attempting to organize a defense, but the rain of arrows continued. Some, unable to raise their shields, were pierced in the shoulder and fell with screams. Jorn awoke with a start, his bowl shattering on the floor. He looked around at the chaos, utterly bewildered. He'd been boasting and drinking porridge, and suddenly he'd been robbed by bandits. The knights quickly shielded Jorn, drawing their swords to meet the attack. Silver-white fighting spirit gleamed on their blades as their war horses reared up and charged towards the enemy. Charge! Two knights charged forward, their fighting spirit surging, their swords gleaming, slashing at the oncoming bandits. The sharp sword energy instantly sliced through the two charging figures, spraying blood onto the muddy mountain path. However, these bandits were no ordinary men. Most of them were berserkers who had cultivated battle aura. A burly bandit leader wielded a giant axe, his body wreathed in dark blue battle aura, and unleashed a powerful sweeping attack. He cleaved the knight and his horse to the ground. The warhorse neighed in agony, cracks appeared in the knight's armor, and blood trickled from his mouth. The two sides clashed fiercely, the light of battle aura flashing in the night, illuminating their bloodshot faces. Jorn tried to calmly command, but the situation was already out of control. The knights, though brave and well coordinated, were outnumbered and their defenses were quickly breached by the bandits. Damn it! Jorn watched helplessly as his knight was cleaved in two by the bandit leader's axe and charged towards him, his heart pounding. What was happening? How were these bandits so strong? Their attack was swift, coordinated, and their target extremely clear. Boss, this kid seems pretty valuable, one bandit shouted. Should we keep him for ransom? Keep him my ass, the bandit leader scoffed. The orders from above are to take him back and slaughter the priest. Hearing this, Jorn panicked completely. Was his glorious journey, just beginning, going to end here? Boom. A loud crash suddenly echoed from the distant mountain path. Immediately afterward, the heavy sound of iron hooves, accompanied by a deafening roar, approached. Charge! Jorn looked up sharply and saw a troop of fully armed knights charging towards the battlefield from the mountain path not far away. Like a thunderous spear, they pierced the battlefield. Jorn immediately spotted Lewis, who was directing from the rear, his black hair flying in the wind. Lewis appeared like a peerless hero, riding on a seven-colored cloud, making Jorn burst into tears of excitement. Boss! You're here, Jorn shouted at Lewis with all his might. Lewis ignored him, his gaze fixed on the enemy, and gave the order, Attack. Lewis's Knights squad was completely different from Yorn's. They had undergone extensive training and were now perfectly coordinated. They were also well prepared for an ambush, not rushing to rescue, but waiting until the enemy was off guard and their own forces were in the most danger before striking. They delivered a fatal blow to the bandits. Kill. The Knights unleashed their full fighting spirit, charging into the battlefield like thunder. A dozen war horses swept across, and amidst the clash of swords, blood splattered. Stop them. Just as a bandit raised his weapon, a spear burning with fighting spirit hurtled towards him from afar, piercing his chest and pinning him to the ground. Then, Lambert unleashed a sword aura, instantly knocking down 3 or 4 bandits. Their bodies tumbled through the air, landing as bloody messes. The bandits hastily fought back, some not even having time to gather their fighting spirit before being cut down one after another. The remaining bandits panicked completely, trying to escape, only to find themselves surrounded by cavalry. Some managed to escape, but the war horses were far faster than them. After only a few steps, they were pierced through the back by spears and fell to the ground. The Knights didn't engage the bandits in close combat. Their horses charged relentlessly, and with every sword strike and every spear thrust, bandits fell. They weren't fighting, they were reaping. Reaping like the Grim Reaper. Damn it, the only remaining, burly bandit leader, who still possessed some strength, roared, his dark blue battle aura surging wildly as he swung his giant axe. However, several Knights quickly moved forward, their long swords clashing to block his movements, their shields slamming into him, forcing him back half a step. The next instant, a flash of cold light appeared, and a sharp blade pierced his battle aura defense, spraying blood. The bandit leader's eyes widened in disbelief at his fate, and he finally collapsed helplessly. With their leader dead, the bandits had no more power to resist. The battle ended incredibly quickly. Yorn even felt that the nightmare he had just experienced was merely an illusion. Lewis, mounted on his horse, coldly surveyed his surroundings. The scattered fugitives had been wiped out. Only about 20 prisoners remained, bound hand and foot to the ground, bearing wounds of varying degrees, their expressions still filled with hatred. Lambert stepped forward and whispered, "It's confirmed, they are all members of the Snowsworn." The Snowsworn, Lewis had heard of this organization. A rebellious group originating from the Snow Kingdom of the North. Their ancestors were warriors of the Snow Kingdom until the Imperial Army conquered the North, destroyed their royal court, and killed their royalty. The surviving descendants hid in the wilderness, gathering strength, vowing to one day pay for their crimes. So it was them. Lewis nodded thoughtfully, then slowly walked towards the prisoners. As he approached, the group's eyes blazed with fury. "Dogs of the Empire. One day, you will all pay for your crimes in blood. Kill us. One day, you will be buried on this land. You invaders, you will die a horrible death." One of the prisoners, his eyes fierce, spat out a curse filled with hatred, then spat a mouthful of blood at Lewis. The knight beside him flew into a rage, kicking him to the ground, his sword pressed against his neck, shouting, "Insolence!" Even so, the prisoners still stared intently at them, their eyes filled with deep-seated hatred, showing no sign of yielding. Lewis watched this scene in silence. These people had been bandits for too long, and were deeply mired in hatred. They could not be easily tamed or reformed. Keeping them alive would only become a source of unpredictable trouble. So he no longer hesitated, calmly waving his hand and saying indifferently, "Execute them all." The soldiers obeyed, dragging the prisoners aside one by one, blades flashing, blood splattering on the ground. Chapter 33 The Snow Oath. Lewis watched as the Snowsworn were dragged away for execution not far away, while Yorn chattered incessantly beside him. The guy was now beaming with adoration, his eyes shining like a puppy seeing its master, circling Lewis and seemingly wagging its tail. Yorn grinned obsequiously, "Boss. If it weren't for you, I'd probably be dead by these desperados. You're like a second parent to me. Back in the capital, I knew you were no ordinary person. And now you're just as amazing. Stop flattering me." Lewis glanced at him, frowning. "What are you doing here, huh?" "Didn't I come here to be a pioneer lord?" Yorn said matter-of-factly. Lewis stared at him with some doubt. "With your qualifications, you shouldn't have been sent to the north." Yorn shrugged, answering matter-of-factly, "I volunteered." "Huh?" Lewis was taken aback by his words, wondering if he'd misheard. "Anyway, I won't get any of the benefits from my family, so I might as well go somewhere far away." Yorn shrugged casually. "And you're here too. I figured following the boss is better than being a boring little son at home." "Did your old man agree?" Of course not. But I submitted a request to expand, and the Emperor approved it quickly. Yorn snorted smugly. Now I have no choice but to come. Lewis was silent for a moment. The North, which others would avoid like the plague, was actually being offered up. I've already chosen a territory next to yours. From now on, we brothers will dominate the North together and make those who look down on us unable to reach us. Yorn patted his shoulder and leaned closer with a grin. These words immediately amused Lewis. He shook his head and asked, "All right, how many resources and men did you bring? You underestimate me." "How could I not be prepared?" Yorn patted his round belly, looking confident. "Over 600 people, including artisans, soldiers, and serfs, basically self-sufficient. The old man will send more over later." He then looked around, leaned closer to Lewis, and lowered his voice, saying, "And I also have 10,000 gold coins." Lewis was stunned, feeling as if he'd been struck by lightning. 10,000? That was 20 times his current wealth. Truly worthy of being a newly minted tycoon, Lewis couldn't help but exclaim. Yorn chuckled, clearly quite proud of his wealth. He pulled out a heavy gold bag and slapped it into Lewis's hand with a thud. "This is just a small token, boss. You absolutely have to accept it, otherwise I'll feel bad." Lewis looked down at the huge bag of gold coins, estimating there were over 100, his lips twitching slightly. He looked up at Yorn. "Do you think I'm a mercenary? Don't say that. This is my respect for you, boss." Yorn waved his hands repeatedly, his face serious. "You saved my life. What are these gold coins?" Lewis sighed helplessly, but still put the gold coins away. After all, he was indeed a bit poor right now. "Then why don't you come to my place first, and have a good meal while you're at it?" Yorn waved his hand. "Not yet. I need to settle my men first." "Okay, come over when you're done." Then Lewis chatted with Yorn for a while before preparing to lead his team back to Red Tide territory. Yorn stood before the camp, laughing and waving. "Take care, boss. I'll come find you for a drink once I'm settled." Lewis glanced back at him, smiled, and said nothing more before leading his knights away. Yorn watched them go. Only when the group disappeared into the mountain path did he turn his gaze away and excitedly roar to his knights, "Full speed ahead towards our territory. Let's begin our conquest." The knights exchanged glances, only able to respond helplessly. A cold wind howled past, the Snowsworn's secret main camp hidden among the northern mountains. Several nobles of the Ironblood Empire were hung upside down on a strange altar, writhing in agony. Their mouths were gagged with rags, leaving only their eyes wide open in despair, several conspicuous wounds on their bodies. Blood seeped from the wounds, slowly flowing down their cheeks into the altar carved with eerie runes. "Ancient god of the frost abyss, grant us the blessing of vengeance," the priest chanted in a low voice. Suddenly, a nauseating, low groaning sound came from the ground, seemingly responding to the priest's prayer. Then, a chilling coldness seeped from the cracks. The corpse on the altar began to wither rapidly, its flesh and blood seemingly devoured by an invisible force. The nobleman's eyes bulged, blood flowing from his 7 orifices, turning him into a dried-up skeleton. Standing high above, Hero coldly surveyed everything on the altar, his face expressionless. His gaze fell on the pool of blood, as if through it he saw his mother lying there years ago. 40 years ago, the Iron Cavalry of the Empire trampled their homeland, burning their royal court. As a child, he huddled in the shadows, only able to watch his mother being dragged by soldiers, pierced by swords, her eyes filled with resentment and pain. Thinking of this, his fingers tightened slightly, a surge of killing intent rising within him. Elder Grom approached slowly, draped in a heavy gray animal hide cloak, his cloudy eyes filled with deep worry. "Hero, a true peasant returned," his voice was trembling with unease. Hero looked away from the altar and said in a low voice, "I know." Elder Grom was silent for a moment before finally speaking. "If this continues, we'll be in trouble." Hero gave him a cold glance. "Blood for blood," Grom sighed, then said in a low voice, "That barbarian witch has ill intentions. She's just using our hatred to pave the way for her tribe." Hero's gaze was icy, his voice low. "If she can give us weapons, give us a chance for revenge, what does it matter, and what have we gained? I only see our warriors dwindling." Grom slammed his cane down, his tone unusually sharp. "Enough." Hero's face darkened. Grom wanted to say something more, but Hero waved his hand and said coldly, "Take him away." 2 Snowsworn warriors immediately stepped forward, grabbed Grom's arms tightly, and dragged him away. Grom didn't struggle, only staring intently at Hero, finally sneering, "You'll regret this." Hero didn't look at him again, turning back to gaze at the dying embers of the campfire. The image of his mother's death flashed before his eyes again, pools of blood, cries, the cold laughter of the Imperial soldiers. Blood debt, blood for blood, he murmured again, his voice low and deep, like a chilling wind. The fire died down completely, and Hero's gaze disappeared into the night. Chapter 34 The White-Haired Little Secretary. Sif was a little nervous. Today was her first day as the Crimson Tide Lord's secretary. She didn't have much affection for Louis, even harboring some wariness. In her eyes, this lord was merely an imperial nobleman in disguise, essentially no different from the ugly nobles of the iron-blooded empire. She arrived at the lord's room on time, and what came into view was a figure meditating cross-legged. Louis was circulating his breathing technique to cultivate his battle aura. This was the second time she had seen this young lord, but compared to their first encounter in the hospital room, she observed him more closely this time. He had distinct features, a slender figure, and a calm demeanor between his brows. Unlike those nobles in brocade robes and with bulky bodies, he resembled a scholar, even displaying a calm and focused concentration during cultivation. This kind of demeanor made it difficult for Sif to equate him with the cunning imperial nobles she had in mind. But she quickly collected her thoughts. This guy was probably just putting on an act. If he were truly this diligent, his strength shouldn't be so low. After finishing his training, Louis opened his eyes and immediately saw her. "You're here early," Louis said with a relaxed smile. Sif nodded without speaking. Today, she was wearing a simple leather coat from a craftsman's workshop, making her look capable and efficient. Louis glanced at her casually, thinking that if supplies in the north weren't so scarce, it wouldn't be bad to provide her with a maid's outfit. But then he thought better of it. It was still quite cold. Besides, he wasn't used to being waited on, and there weren't any young maids specifically to serve him in the entire Red Tide territory, only an older woman responsible for cleaning and laundry. "I'm not blaming you, but I have sword training later, and I won't officially start working for another hour," Louis explained. Sif simply nodded again, saying nothing more. Then Louis left the room and began his daily sword training with Lambert. During training, Lambert wielded his sword steadily, his attacks fierce, each strike precise and powerful. Louis, on the other hand, focused more on technique, relying on agile footwork to dodge and find opportunities to counterattack. "Keep your footing steady," Lambert warned in a deep voice, then slashed down with his sword. Louis quickly dodged, but Lambert's counterattack was swift, his sword sweeping across. Louis was forced to raise his sword to parry, the impact sending him staggering back several steps, his arm slightly numb. Sif watched from the side, inwardly assessing. Lambert's strength was considerably greater than hers. Louis's swordsmanship was decent, but only decent. He was just all show, she thought. But then she noticed that no matter how Lambert attacked, Louis never slacked off, always fighting seriously. Again, Lambert asked. Of course, Louis wiped the sweat from his brow and readjusted his stance. Sif frowned slightly. This guy didn't seem to be just going through the motions, but genuinely trying to improve. Swordsmanship was a daily necessity for Louis. Since arriving in Red Tide territory, he had asked Lambert to teach him swordsmanship for an hour every day. And so, an hour of swordsmanship training passed in constant exchange and adjustments. Louis sheathed his sword, let out a long breath, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and revealed a hearty smile. Sif glanced at him slightly. He was indeed quite handsome. "Let's go. Let's begin the day's lordly affairs," Louis said to her casually. "Don't be so nervous. The secretary's job is actually quite simple." He casually explained some key points, and finally summarized, "Your main task today is to accompany me and record my work for the day." Sif nodded and replied calmly, "Understood." Louis's first task as lord was to inspect the soldiers training at the training ground. 120 soldiers formed a square formation and ran around the field in a grand procession. Their steps were uniform, and although they were panting, no one complained of being tired. 5 more laps. Speed up, move. Faster. Faster. Haven't you eaten enough? Keep going. Keep running. Your abilities are far more than this. The night instructor ran alongside them, constantly shouting slogans. This training method was completely different from the training methods of other noble territories in the Iron Blood Empire. Other nobles at most trained physical strength and individual melee weapon skills. This relied on traditional master-apprentice instruction, but the training was often fragmented, resulting in soldiers with a weak foundation. This led to ordinary soldiers becoming cannon fodder for bloodline knights on the battlefield. But Lewis understood that this was a low magic world, where even the strongest legendary knight couldn't slay an enemy with a single sword strike and break through more than 2,600 armor. The most common apprentice knights, against well-trained soldiers, could at most fight 10 at once, equivalent to 2 Ip-Mans. However, training them was 100 times more difficult than training an ordinary male soldier. Therefore, based on his knowledge from his previous life, Lewis designed a more systematic training system. Purely standardized training, focusing more on soldiers' teamwork and rapid reaction capabilities, and especially emphasizing battlefield adaptability. Although these soldiers lacked fighting spirit, he believed that with this training, they could become a fighting force. Attention! The soldiers stopped abruptly and turned to face forward. Lewis walked slowly, his every move exuding an aura of authority that made all the soldiers involuntarily stand even straighter. "Good morning, Lord," the soldiers shouted in unison, their voices deafening. Lewis nodded slightly, his tone indifferent. "You've worked hard, we're not working hard," their reply was firm and resounding. These soldiers underwent a series of training exercises every day, including physical conditioning, formation drills, and simulated combat. Although the training intensity had increased, no one complained. They were well fed and warmly dressed, and Lord Lewis had shown them unprecedented respect. Every one of them remembered the Lord's kindness. Lewis glanced around, his gaze landing on a few soldiers whose movements were not up to standard. On the battlefield, such sluggishness would cost you and your comrades your heads. The soldiers immediately broke out in a cold sweat and quickly bowed their heads in agreement. "Run 5 more laps." "Yes, sir." The soldiers turned and continued running without hesitation, their strides becoming even more powerful. Sif stood aside, watching the soldiers run in perfect unison, a complex feeling rising in her heart. She didn't fully understand the meaning of this training, but she could clearly feel that the soldiers' respect for Lewis was genuine. Although Lewis didn't shout orders or make any exaggerated gestures, every word he uttered commanded the soldiers' unwavering obedience. This young lord truly seemed different from ordinary nobles. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35: Great Development of Fisheries and Agriculture. After leaving the training grounds, Lewis led Sif along a dirt path, suddenly stopping and heading towards a simple but clean wooden hut. "I'll go in and take a look," he said, pushing open the door. The room was dimly lit, filled with the faint scent of herbs. A knight lay on a wooden bed against the wall, his face still pale, but much better than before. He was none other than Havel, the knight who had been wounded in the battle against the frost giant several days ago. Seeing Lewis enter, he instinctively struggled to rise and bow, but Lewis gently pressed him down. "Don't move around," Lewis frowned. "Your injuries aren't fully healed yet." Javier gave a somewhat embarrassed smile. "My lord, I'm much better now, don't push yourself." Lewis pulled up a chair and sat down. "What did the doctor say?" "He's stabilized, but recovery will take some time." Javier lowered his head, but seemed somewhat unwilling. "I'm sorry to have worried you. It's already a miracle you're alive." Lewis sighed softly. "Don't worry, I'll find a suitable medicine as soon as possible to help you recover your strength quickly." "Thank you. I will never forget your kindness, my lord. Once I'm healed, I will definitely continue to serve the Crimson Tide territory." Javier's voice trembled slightly, his words filled with loyalty. Sif stood aside, watching this scene, a slight ripple in her heart. She had initially thought Lewis was just putting on a show, putting on a facade. But seeing the undisguised loyalty in the wounded knight's eyes, she suddenly wavered. "Don't make it sound like a farewell," Lewis chuckled, rising to pat him on the shoulder. "Take good care of your injuries, don't rush back and embarrass yourself." Before leaving, he even instructed the guards to take good care of him, bringing tears to Javier's eyes again. After bidding farewell to Javier, Lewis led Sif eastward toward the riverbank. Morning light shimmered on the water, creating sparkling ripples. Several fishing boats were leisurely moored along the shore, fishermen busy preparing their nets, their occasional hearty laughter echoing through the air. Lewis looked around. The fishing industry had entered a stable phase. The number of fishing boats was greater than initially, but the harvest wasn't as bountiful. He wasn't surprised. This was the result of his deliberate actions. To avoid overfishing and ensure the continued reproduction of the fish, he ordered the mesh size of the nets to be enlarged, ensuring that young fish could escape. At the same time, fishing had to adhere to fixed times, with a closed season to allow the river and fish to rest, ensuring the sustainable development of the fishing industry. Fisheries official Luke, seeing Lewis, hurried forward, his face slightly obsequious. Lewis nodded slightly, his gaze sweeping across the river. "How is the aquaculture progressing?" "We've already started experimenting," Luke patted his chest. "We've selected several types of fish adapted to cold water and are trying semi-enclosed aquaculture." He pointed to the raft on the water, speaking excitedly. "It's all thanks to the Lord's foresight that we've considered long-term development so early on. Otherwise, the fish would be all gone in a few years." "You've done a good job," Lewis casually praised. Luke immediately smiled, waving his hands repeatedly. "Not at all. It's all thanks to the Lord's wise leadership." Lewis chuckled lightly, offering no reply. Sif watched this scene, secretly pursing her lips. She scoffed at this flattery of the Lord's wisdom, but had to admit that the people of Red Tide territory truly trusted him. Lewis glanced at Sif, a slight smile playing on his lips, fully aware of her inner thoughts, but too lazy to explain. "Let's go," Lewis said, striding towards the Red Tide territory's farmland. The vast fields stretched out in the morning light. The rye stalks were noticeably thick, their deep green leaves swaying gently in the breeze. The potato foliage was lush, and the turnips were thriving, a vibrant scene of life. Agricultural Officer Mick was inspecting the fields with several farmers. Upon seeing Lewis, he quickly stepped forward, brushing the dirt off his hands with a simple smile. "In about 10 days, the turnips will be ready for harvest. The rye is growing well, and the potatoes are doing fine. We should have a good harvest," Mick said to Lewis, a hint of pride in his voice. Lewis nodded, his gaze sweeping across the fields. He noticed the neat rows in moist soil, clearly indicating careful tending. "Well done, Mick," he praised. Mick paused for a moment, then his smile widened, even showing a touch of excitement. He clenched his fist, as if trying to suppress his joy, yet a smile still managed to escape his lips. He owed his current position entirely to the young lord before him. Before, he was merely a slave toiling in the fields, unworthy even to look a noble in the eye. But Lewis not only granted him freedom but also put him in charge of the entire Red Tide territory's farmland, transforming him from a lowly slave into an agricultural supervisor. Now, his greatest goal in life was to do everything in his power to improve agriculture in Red Tide territory, to ensure the land could feed more people, and to make this territory more prosperous than anywhere else. "My lord, I will certainly not let you down," Mick said solemnly, his voice trembling slightly. Lewis smiled slightly and patted his shoulder. "Keep it up." Then, looking at the radiant Mick, he suddenly remembered something and raised an eyebrow, asking, "How's it going?" "Getting used to married life." Mick was taken aback, then blushed and stammered, waving his hands, "And nothing, lord. Please don't tease me." Lewis laughed and patted his shoulder. "You still need to be a little more restrained. I don't want you to be too tired to get up one day." The surrounding farmers also laughed, and the atmosphere immediately lightened considerably. From morning until now, in Sif's eyes, Lewis had gradually transformed from a cunning nobleman into a leader who cared about the territory, was approachable, and prestigious. Whether he was genuine or not, at least the people truly respected and loved him. She was somewhat worried that if every territory in the north developed as steadily as Crimson Tide territory, the Frost Moon tribe would face a great threat. But then she thought, so what if there was a threat? Those were the traitors who killed her family, it's better they were dead. Sif snapped out of her reverie and looked at Lewis not far away. The man stood in the field, casually conversing with farmers and slaves, his tone relaxed, a lazy smile playing on his lips. A gentle breeze ruffled his dark hair, and against the sunlight, his profile appeared remarkably defined. For some reason, Sif found herself somewhat mesmerized. Chapter 36 Smashing the Dragon Down with a Stone. After leaving the farmland, Lewis approached Sif mysteriously and whispered, "Come on, I'll take you to eat something good." Sif looked at him suspiciously but followed him anyway. They arrived at a small workshop, where a faint sweet aroma filled the air. Inside, a middle-aged woman was intently stirring syrup in a pot. Her name was Doris, a refugee who had come to the north with Lewis. A few days ago, Lewis learned through the daily intelligence system that she was skilled in sugar making, so he specially arranged for people to help her collect tree sap and try to make birch sugar. The first batch of sugar had been made, and today was the second batch being boiled. Outside the workshop, workers were methodically collecting tree sap from the birch forest. They drilled holes about a meter above the ground in the tree trunks, then carefully inserted tubes to allow the clear sap to slowly flow into wooden buckets. Don't harvest too much from each tree each day, no more than half a bucket, otherwise you'll damage the tree, Doris instructed the workers as she worked. Remember to seal the tree holes after harvesting, a cork will do. The boiling syrup bubbled and simmered, the sweet aroma in the air growing stronger. Oh, Lord, Doris looked up and saw Louis, a smile spreading across her face. You've come at the perfect time. The candy we made yesterday has cooled, and we can eat it today. Louis smelled the sweet fragrance in the air and smiled. Then we're in for a treat today. Doris grabbed a piece of golden, translucent birch syrup from a wooden tray beside her and handed it to Louis. Louis casually popped it into his mouth, chewed it, and exclaimed, it tastes really good. Then he casually picked up another piece and offered it to Sif. You should try some too. Sif frowned, not taking it immediately, but staring warily at the candy. She had never seen such a strange food before and even suspected that Louis might have added poison to it. Seeing this, Louis smiled and deliberately popped the candy into his mouth, crunching it loudly. See, it's not poisonous. Sif then carefully took the candy, hesitated slightly, and put it in her mouth. The sweetness instantly spread in her mouth, carrying a unique woody fragrance, a taste she had never experienced before. Her eyes widened slightly, the coldness on her face vanishing for a moment, but she quickly suppressed it. Then, pretending to be nonchalant, she swallowed it and nodded gently. It's all right, but the slight upturn of her lips betrayed her true feelings. Louis saw it clearly and couldn't help but laugh, grabbing a small bag of candy and stuffing it into her hand. Take it if you like. Sif clutched the bag of candy tightly, lowering her head without speaking, but her ears quietly turned red. Then Louis nodded to Doris with satisfaction. The taste is good, better than I expected. Well done, continue to produce more. Hearing the praise, Doris's mouth also blossomed into a smile. Yes, my lord, I will definitely work hard. However, Louis quickly thought of a problem. Birch sap can only be collected for a few short weeks in spring. After that, the sap flow stops. What a pity, he sighed softly. The collection period is too short to make it a specialty product for sale. Doris sighed regretfully as well. Yes, after all, the sap won't be available for collection in a while. Louis stroked his chin, pondering for a moment. However, since we can make birch sugar, we can try planting fruit trees and see if we can make fructose. Lord, you are indeed clever. If we can grow good fruit, perhaps we can make even more kinds of sugar. Doris nodded excitedly. Let's take it slow, Louis said casually. When conditions allow, we'll have the artisans try building a sugar mill. Doris's eyes were full of enthusiasm. Thank you, Lord. I will definitely research more methods. Louis then grabbed a small bag for himself and stuffed it into his pocket, leaving a large bag of sugar remaining in the workshop. Louis ordered, "Give these candies to the children." The accompanying knights immediately took the bags of candy, preparing to distribute them at the school. Yes, Louis had run a school, but it was more like a nursery than a school. Children under the age of 13 were gathered there and cared for by several women. This allowed the children to learn some basic knowledge while freeing their parents from labor. Fortunately, there weren't many children in Red Tide territory, otherwise this arrangement would probably be difficult to maintain. Moreover, once the children turned 13, they had to start working, such as helping with fishing. When they arrived at the school, they happened to overhear the women caring for the children vividly telling them stories about Louis. Lord Louis had just returned from the north with his knights after slaughtering orcs, his armor still stained with the green blood. He and several knights immediately prepared a celebratory banquet. Everyone was busy until midnight and was about to leave when he suddenly stomped on a stone, pointed to the sky, and cursed, "You dragon, wandering around my territory every day, do you really think I'm a pushover?" Saying this, he bent down, picked up a pebble, swung his arm, and smashed it into the sky. The stone shot out as a streak of red light, actually tearing a hole in the clouds. A mournful howl followed, and a 30-meter-long frost dragon tumbled down, crashing into the black pine forest with a thunderous crash. Sif listened to the story of smashing down a dragon with a stone. Her lips twitched slightly, her gaze slowly shifting to Louis beside her, her eyes filled with silent disdain. Louis, somewhat embarrassed, coughed lightly and explained in a low voice, "They made it up themselves." Sif crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Is that so?" Lewis's gaze drifted elsewhere. Suddenly, a child caught sight of a figure at the doorway. "The Great Lord has arrived," a child shouted first, and then, as if ignited, the entire room erupted in cheers. "Lord! The Great Lord!" The children jumped and danced around Lewis, their eyes filled with admiration and anticipation. Clearly, this wasn't his first visit. A hint of helplessness flickered in Lewis's eyes as he faced the enthusiastic children, but he still smiled and patted the head of the nearest child. Then he took the bag of candy from the knight, grabbed a handful, and bent down to distribute it to the children. The children excitedly accepted the candy, cheering. "Thank you, Lord," they exclaimed, eagerly stuffing the candy into their mouths. As the candy melted in their mouths, innocent smiles bloomed on their faces, filled with sweet satisfaction. Seeing the children's genuine smiles, Sif's previously gloomy mood unconsciously lightened a little. Chapter 37 Training the Wolf. As night fell, Lewis, Sif, and several knights sat in the dining room for dinner. A few dim oil lamps were lit, illuminating the simple meal on the long wooden table. Smoked fish, with a faint aroma of wood, steamed with porridge, and a few pieces of coarse wheat bread and some pickled vegetables sat nearby. The dining room was devoid of any ornate decorations. The wooden tables and chairs, the slightly yellowed oil lamps, and even the cracks in the wooden walls were all striking. Sif looked at all this with some surprise. This was completely different from the aristocratic life she had imagined. In her mind, a noble's table should be covered with a gold-embroidered tablecloth, plates piled high with exquisite food, gleaming silverware, and glasses filled with fine wine. But the reality was that Lewis's dinner, while slightly better than that of ordinary citizens, was far from luxurious. Lewis noticed the subtle change in her expression. "Not to your liking," Sif quickly shook her head. "No, although she had once been a princess of the tribe and ate better than she did now, resources in the north were scarce, and she couldn't afford to be extravagant." She picked up the porridge and took a sip. The warm, weedy aroma spread in her mouth, and the taste was quite good. Halfway through the meal, Sif looked up and casually asked, "What are you going to do tonight?" Lewis, chewing on smoked fish, said, "Train the wolf, train the wolf." Sif was taken aback for a moment, then her eyes lit up. Lewis nodded. "Yes, now, Lewis spends several evenings each week at the training grounds training the dire wolf Cold Fang. After several weeks of training, Cold Fang has begun to respond to Lewis's commands, but it still needs more practice to fully obey. Today they were practicing hunting whistles. Hunting whistles are a system of whistles specifically used to tame wild animals, often used for hunting, fighting, or patrolling. It uses different tones and rhythms to help the animal understand and execute commands. Lewis raised her hand, placed the whistle to her lips, and blew a long, high-pitched note. Lang Feng's body tensed slightly, then he crouched low, limbs pressed against the ground, ready to ambush his prey. Lewis then blew two short notes. Lang Feng leaped up, swiftly pouncing on the target, his sharp fangs biting into the cloth decoy, tearing it apart with a mighty rip. The cloth ripped, and a low growl escaped the wolf's throat. Finally, Lewis blew a series of rapid trills. Lang Feng abruptly stopped, warily scanning his surroundings, then released his grip and quickly retreated back to Lewis's side. The entire sequence of movements was fluid and crisp, demonstrating a certain level of tactical coordination. Lewis nodded in satisfaction, gently stroking Lang Feng's neck. "Well done," he murmured, then pulled a piece of sliced meat from his waist and offered it to Lang Feng. Lang Feng licked his fangs but didn't pounce immediately. Instead, he glanced at Lewis, confirming his master's permission, before suddenly opening his mouth and biting into the meat, letting out a satisfied growl. "It's starting to get going." The beast trainer, Ager, stepped forward respectfully, his tone tinged with satisfaction. "Your progress in taming it is faster than I expected. However, to make Lang Feng completely obedient, more time is needed. After all, dire wolves are different from ordinary beasts. Trust in obedience must be built up little by little." "Yes, I know," Lewis replied. Sif looked at the dire wolf in the training field, her expression gradually darkening. Back in the tribe, she also had a dire wolf. Lonely Moon. It was the dire wolf she had raised from cubs. They hunted together, ran together in the blizzard, and kept each other warm in the cold nights. But now, it was probably. Sif's hands clenched unconsciously, her fingertips digging into her palms. Killed, perhaps. In the days since waking from her coma, Sif had tried to avoid thinking about these tragedies, but she couldn't help it. Lewis glanced at her, seemingly noticing her unease, and asked softly, "What's wrong?" Sif was silent for a moment, but finally couldn't help but speak. "I used to have a diarrhea, but it's dead." Her tone was calm, as if stating something unrelated to herself. Lewis pondered for a moment, then pointed to a group of dire-wolf pups in the distant enclosure. "Would you like to choose another one?" Sif froze, as if she hadn't quite grasped the situation. She looked at the group of furry pups, some sitting, some lying down, huddled together softly. Her gaze slowly swept over each one, finally settling on a pup in the corner. Its fur had a pale silver-gray tinge, and its pupils were ice blue, somewhat resembling the lonely moon in her memory. She stepped forward and gently extended her hand. The pup timidly sniffed her fingertips, then cautiously stuck out its tongue and licked her palm. In that instant, it was as if she had been pulled back from the labyrinth of her memories. Sif's eyes reddened slightly as her fingertips gently stroked the wolf cub's soft fur. "Then you'll be called Lone Moon from now on," the little wolf whimpered softly, as if in response. Sif's throat tightened slightly. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something, but no sound came out. The next moment, warm tears silently slid down, landing on the wolf cub's soft fur. And so, training continued, and night deepened. Lewis stood at the edge of the training field, casually stretching, and turned to look at Sif. "That concludes today's work. Remember to write down my schedule when you get back." Sif nodded, turned, and returned to her hut. As one of only 3 literate individuals in the territory, Lewis had specially arranged a separate room for her. The wolf cub hadn't been brought back yet, as it hadn't fully accepted her as its master. Sif sighed softly, clearing her mind of distractions, and walked to her desk, lighting the oil lamp. She opened her notebook and began writing down the day's events, line by line. In the morning, the Lord personally trained the soldiers, who treated him with utmost respect. The Lord inspected farmland and fisheries, offering development suggestions. He showed care to the wounded knight and promised better medicine. He discovered the potential of birch sugar and attempted to promote the sugar industry. After finishing writing Lewis's itinerary, Sif stared at the lines for a long time, a complex mix of emotions welling up inside her. Despite being a lord, he possessed none of the arrogance of a nobleman. Wherever he went, he was deeply respected. She lightly touched her pen to another sheet of paper and wrote 4 words, "A good person." After writing it, she looked at the sentence with a sudden, slightly resentful air, muttering smugly, most likely faking it, but deep down, she no longer believed it. She casually popped a piece of birch sugar into her mouth. The sweetness melted in her mouth, carrying a unique, woody fragrance. Sif leaned back in her chair and softly murmured, so sweet." Chapter 38. Bradley arrives in red tide territory. Although it was spring, the north remained bitterly cold, and even thick cloaks offered little protection against a penetrating chill. "My lord, we're almost there," a knight reported in a low voice to the elder at the head of the column, reining in his horse. Bradley nodded slightly, his expression unchanged, continuing to ride silently across the frozen ground. The column traversed the desolate north in silence. This wasn't because they were without resentment towards the mission, but out of reverence for Bradley. He was Duke Calvin's old steward, a man of high rank and influence, whose position within the Calvin family was comparable to some collateral nobles. Even if the knights harbored doubts, they dared not speak freely in his presence. Along the way, they passed through several newly established territories, all dilapidated and desolate. Even Frostspire, the seat of the northern governor's office, was seen by these southerners as nothing more than a shabby military outpost. No one expected red tide territory to be any different. Bradley was no exception. In his memory, Lewis was merely one of the Duke's 20-odd sons, mediocre in talent, honest in character, and even somewhat dull. Neglected from a young age, he had been sent by the Duke to the harsh, northern lands a few months prior to fend for himself. Yet now, in a letter to the Duke, he wrote that his newly established territory was well managed, developing rapidly, and that he had even discovered precious magic marrow mines. Bradley was skeptical of the letter's contents. A young man not yet 20, with virtually no resources, could manage a wasteland so well? It seemed far too exaggerated. Moreover, magic marrow mines were an extremely scarce resource in the Ironblood Empire, which relied almost entirely on imports from the Emerald Federation. And yet, a large quantity of magic marrow mines had been discovered in his own territory? There was likely some exaggeration involved. But regardless, he had come, without complaint or the slightest slackening. Because he was Bradley, the most loyal steward of the Calvin family. He wanted to see if this young lord could live up to everything he described in the letter. If Lewis showed promise, he would wholeheartedly support him. If Lewis disappointed him, he would not hesitate to withdraw all support. In the cold wind, the outline of Crimson Tide territory gradually emerged. On a distant mountain path, Lewis rode a black warhorse, draped in a thick wolfskin cloak, his jet-black hair billowing in the wind. He bore a striking resemblance to the Duke, but lacked some of his imposing presence, possessing instead a more refined air. At his feet stood a lithe, agile dire wolf cub, exuding an untamed, wild aura. This scene subtly raised Bradley's opinion of Lewis. He was far superior to the useless young master he had imagined. The knights were also somewhat surprised. They had expected to be greeted by a disheveled, impoverished young master trapped in a barren fiefdom, but instead, he was so composed. He had even tamed a dire wolf. Lewis rode forward, bowing respectfully to Bradley. Mr. Bradley, you must be tired from your journey. Welcome to Red Tide territory. Bradley returned the bow with the standard etiquette of a butler, his attitude neither overly warm nor impeccable. Young master, you are too kind. His Excellency the Duke sent me with some support, hoping it will be of assistance to you. I will remember my father's concern. Bradley silently observed Lewis, his opinion of him beginning to change. After all, maintaining such composure as a nobleman in this barren and cruel northern land was no easy feat. Lewis rode forward slowly, his gaze sweeping over the troop and supplies Bradley had brought, a slight thought stirring within him. 3 elite knights, 10 regular knights, 30 apprentice knights, dozens of artisans, physicians, and other skilled personnel. Several carts of grain, wheat flour, dried meat, and pickled vegetables. Seeds of cold-resistant crops, dozens of black-horned cattle, cold-weather sheep, and cold-resistant war horses. He hadn't initially held much hope for his father's support. After all, he, as a son, was not highly regarded. But now it seems this batch of supplies has far exceeded expectations. The old man did manage to get some gold coins, although it's still just a drop in the ocean for the Calvin family. Bradley said calmly, "Young master, this isn't much, consider it an opportunity for you." He paused, repeating the Duke's words, "If you can govern the territory well, the family will increase investment, but if you show any incompetence, the family will immediately withdraw all support." Lewis simply smiled slightly. "I will cherish this opportunity." While Lewis observed the aid, Bradley was also observing Red Tide territory. Upon entering this land, it looked no different from other northern territories, desolate, barren, and lifeless. Bradley nodded to himself, just as he expected. But as the group ventured deeper, his expression gradually became subtle. The first thing that caught his eye was vast fields of thriving crops, and patches of wasteland being cultivated. The people were working with great enthusiasm, sweat mixed with mud, but their faces showed no complaints, only hope. Something was wrong. How did they do it? While most of the other pioneering territories in the north were still in the sowing stage, the crops in Red Tide territory were already nearing harvest. Even new reclamation work was underway simultaneously. What did this mean? It meant that Lewis was far ahead of other pioneering lords in agricultural management. Bradley noticed the neat rows of semi-subterranean longhouses lining both sides of the road. These houses, though simple, were all new buildings. Clearly, they had been completed recently. In other words, Red Tide territory had not only solved its survival problem but also expanded its infrastructure in a short period. This was even better than some territories that had been developing for many years. As he traveled, Bradley saw more and more. Each detail made Bradley's brow furrow deeper and deeper. But what truly alarmed him were the people he passed along the way. The way they looked at Lewis revealed genuine respect and affection. It wasn't the fear of nobles, nor gratitude for a benefactor, but a near devout faith. This kid, is he a born ruler? Bradley's heart skipped a beat, and he began to reevaluate his unassuming young master. It could be said that Lewis's control over the Crimson Tide territory was even more thorough than the Duke's rule in the south. He had claimed in his letter that he was a capable ruler, but now it seemed he hadn't lived up to his words. Everyone underestimated him, but it seemed everyone had misjudged him. Perhaps he wouldn't inherit the Calvin family fortune, but his future achievements would certainly be remarkable. Thinking of this, Bradley's lips curled into a slight smile, and he felt a strange sense of pleasure. At least I won't be bored in the north. Chapter 39 Demon Mine. 2 days later, Lewis, along with Bradley, the master craftsman Valentine, and other professional miners, ventured deep into the heart of the Crimson Tide territory along the mountain path. Bradley remained skeptical, believing that there shouldn't be a large-scale magic marrow mine in this area, and that Lewis was exaggerating. After traversing the forest, the view suddenly opened up, revealing a vast mining area. Outside the mine, several knights stood ready. Clad in heavy armor, they vigilantly scanned their surroundings. Upon seeing Lewis and Bradley's group arrive, the knights immediately bowed and said, "My lord, everything is normal in the mine." Lewis nodded and continued leading his men inside. But when they truly stepped into the mine, everyone gasped in astonishment. The reserves of magic marrow here were truly astonishing. Entering the vein, the temperature was slightly higher than outside, and the surface of the ore felt warm. The vein walls had an eerie dark purple hue, faintly shimmering with magical light, and subtle energy fluctuations floated in the air. Valentine, a seasoned master miner, almost instinctively reached out and gently stroked the rock wall. His fingers trembled slightly, his eyes filled with fervor. "My God," he turned to Bradley, his voice trembling with excitement, This vein is at least in the top 20 of all the magic marrow mines in the entire Ironblood Empire." The other craftsmen around were also stunned by the sight before them, whispering amongst themselves. "The reserves are outrageous, the purity of the magic marrow looks very high too. If we mine deeper, we might even find high-grade crystal magic marrow. My lord, this is a treasure bestowed by heaven." Several senior craftsmen's eyes burned with desire, their hands unable to resist stroking the mine wall as if caressing the skin of a courtesan in the capital. Bradley frowned and reprimanded in a deep voice, "Quiet down, don't treat this place like a marketplace." The craftsmen quickly fell silent, but the excitement on their faces was still hard to conceal. And Bradley, seeing such a magic marrow mine, was also overwhelmed with awe. There really were so many magic marrow mines, Lewis hadn't lied. He began to reassess the value of this territory. Magic marrow wasn't just the raw material for making magical explosives. Magic marrow powder could also be incorporated into weapons, enchanting blades to make them cut through iron like mud. Alchemists needed magic marrow to create potent potions. High-purity magic marrow essence was also essential for the core materials of magic arrays. Its value far exceeded ordinary magical minerals. It was a strategic mineral that could influence the entire Northern Territory. The scale and value of this mine far exceeded his and Duke Calvin's imagination. Bradley rode closer to Lewis, his voice lowered. "Young master, it's best not to let too many people know about this mine." Lewis quietly looked at Bradley, waiting for him to continue. "Although the Calvin family is one of the 8 great families of the Empire, ordinary villains wouldn't dare to covet your territory." Bradley paused, his gaze sharpening. "But this is the North, too far from the family. The family's influence may not reach here. It's inevitable that some will take the risk, and this magic marrow mine is worth it." He glanced at Lewis's expression, wanting to gauge the young master's attitude. However, Lewis remained calm, even displaying a composed smile. "I understand," he nodded gently, his tone calm. "Besides mentioning it to my father in a letter, I haven't told anyone else." Bradley carefully observed Lewis's expression and realized he wasn't lying, but genuinely aware of the situation. He nodded slowly, secretly resolving to report the situation to the Duke and have him send more knights. This mine was worth it. Meanwhile, Valentine said to Lewis, "My lord, according to the current survey results, the mine's reserves are indeed astonishing, but it's also much more dangerous than ordinary mines. I suggest we first survey the boundaries of the entire mining area and find the most stable area as the initial mining point." Then I'll leave it to you." Lewis nodded. Valentine led the craftsmen into the mine, hammer in hand, carefully striking the rock walls and listening to the echoes from different areas. "The ore here is a deep purple, indicating a very high content of magic marrow," Valentine said, crouching down and pointing to a piece of ore on the wall that faintly glowed with a dark purple luster. "Especially these crystallized areas, indicating a high-purity vein. However, it also means it's too fragile, the slightest carelessness will cause it to break." He then tapped a nearby rock layer, the sound deep and resonant. "This area has a stable structure, suitable for mining." After taking a few more steps, he tapped another spot, the sound slightly hollow. "But not here. The geology is too fragile. If we mine rashly, it could easily collapse." The craftsman nodded in agreement, marking the areas on the mine walls. Lewis stood by, arms crossed, observing quietly. Although he wasn't an expert in mining, He could tell that Valentine's professionalism was exceptional. "It seems the craftsmen the family sent this time are all experts," Lewis said with a hint of admiration. "Your professionalism has truly broadened my horizons." The craftsmen were taken aback, then revealed a hint of pride. This was their area of expertise, and to be praised by the Lord himself was indeed a source of pride. Bradley nodded slightly, his face remaining calm, but inwardly he sighed. This young master was indeed not incompetent, he knew how to win people's hearts. Valentine continued his analysis. "Because the magic marrow mine releases magical fluctuations, miners who stay here for extended periods may suffer from magic poisoning. A ventilation plan must be implemented to prevent the accumulation of magic in the mine." "Then how should we do that?" Lewis asked. "We need to build ventilation shafts in different areas to allow air convection. We also need to establish isolation passages inside the mine to prevent harmful gases from accumulating," Valentine said, sketching a simple diagram on his parchment. "The support structure will be made of black birch wood, with a support point every 5 meters to ensure the mine tunnels don't collapse. The main tunnel will be 3 meters wide, and the secondary tunnels will be 1.5 meters wide, so transportation won't be crowded." "It's clear you're very professional in this area," Lewis praised. Valentine immediately puffed out his chest, a hint of pride in his voice. "Of course. I'm a veteran miner who's worked my whole life. I can walk through a mine blindfolded and still not get lost." Lewis smiled and patted Valentine on the shoulder. "Then the mining plan for this mine is entrusted to you," Valentine grinned. "Thank you for your appreciation, sir." Chapter 40 The Power of Power. Pay attention. We're building a mine tunnel that can last for decades. Don't blame me for being ruthless if you cut corners. With a comprehensive survey of the mining area completed, Valentine immediately directed the craftsmen to begin reinforcing the tunnel. Black birch wood was cut to standard dimensions, and workers carried heavy beams into the mine. A beam was firmly fixed at each point in the tunnel to ensure its stability. Carpenters reinforced the joints with large wooden wedges and applied resin to the joints to ensure the long-term stability of the supports. Valentine personally tapped each black birch beam with his mining hammer to confirm its sturdiness. Meanwhile, the first batch of miners, composed of slaves, were ready and waiting. They wore simple protective gear and awaited instructions. Valentine nodded. "Start with the most stable area, mine a small area, and see the specific condition of the magic marrow." Upon receiving the order, the miners carefully wielded their pickaxes, striking the rock walls and peeling away chunks of ore each time the pickaxe struck. The purple vein shimmered with a faint glow, as if awakening slumbering magic deep within the earth. The first batch of ore was then delivered to Hilco, the only alchemy apprentice in the Crimson Tide territory. "Test the purity," Lewis briefly instructed. Hilco nodded and dropped a small piece of magic marrow ore into the testing solution. The liquid faintly glowed purple, followed by magical fluctuations that swirled in the air. The solution rapidly deepened in color, turning a profound dark purple, a symbol of high-purity magic marrow. "My lord, the ore's purity is even higher than expected," Hilco's voice betrayed his excitement. Lewis's lips curled into a slight smile. A weight had finally been lifted from his heart. The night was deep, and the candlelight flickered in the study. Lewis sat behind his desk, his gaze fixed on Bradley opposite him. "I wish for the mining and processing of the ore to remain in the Crimson Tide territory, with sales handled by the Calvin family," he stated bluntly. Bradley paused slightly, then gave a meaningful smile. "I understand." Lewis had his own calculations. He needed his family's support now and couldn't show any signs of independence too early. He had to offer enough benefits to keep the family willing to continue investing. Only when the family's interests were met would they provide more resources and protection, allowing him to establish a firm foothold in the northern wastelands. Moreover, he was far less in control of the sales channels than the Calvin family. The Calvin family's trade route spanned the empire and even extended to other countries. If he wanted to develop a sales channel of the same scale, or even a worse one, it would be almost impossible in the short term. Therefore, rather than wasting energy on something he wasn't good at, it was better to stabilize the situation and make money first. But the processing technology had to be in his own hands. If unforeseen circumstances arose in the future, such as the death of Duke Calvino or internal strife within the family, he might lose this sales channel. However, as long as the Crimson Tide territory firmly grasped the refining and processing technology of magic essence, even if he was kicked out of the market, he could still rebuild it instead of being at the mercy of others. Bradley glanced at him, a faint smile playing on his lips. He understood Lewis's ulterior motives, but didn't point it out. "I will draft the letter as you wish and deliver it to Duke Calvin," Bradley said respectfully. He left everything to the Duke's decision. He only needed to fulfill his role and not interfere. Lewis then opened a heavy wooden chest, revealing a chest full of gold coins. There were approximately 1,500 gold coins. The resources provided by the Calvin family this time included 3,000 gold coins, making Lewis suddenly incredibly wealthy. But gold coins, no matter how many, are useless if they cannot be exchanged for tangible resources to develop strength. And what the Red Tide territory needs most right now is population. Lewis closed the wooden crate, glanced at Bradley, and said solemnly, "I want to exchange these gold coins for slaves." A hint of approval flashed in Bradley's eyes. "It seems you already have a clear plan." Lewis nodded. "Based on current grain production and reserves, 1,500 people is the limit I can handle." He wasn't greedy. Too many slaves would become a burden and weaken the stability of the Red Tide territory. "Bradley, leave this to me." This was indeed not a difficult task for the old steward of the Calvin family. Bradley simply wrote a letter. A few days later, a slave owner from 1,000 miles away traveled to the Red Tide territory to personally deliver a batch of carefully selected slaves. His attitude was extremely respectful. Even when negotiating prices, he was cautious, afraid of offending Bradley. These slaves were clearly of much higher quality than the batch of ragtag slaves Lewis had personally purchased from the black market last time. Strong laborers made up the majority, with firm muscles, and although their skin bore the marks of time, their spirits were still quite good. Among them were a group of female slaves of marriageable age, who would play a crucial role in the future population growth of the Red Tide territory. But what surprised Lewis the most was the price of the transaction. After exchanging 1,500 slaves, he still had a full 700 gold coins left. "Much cheaper than I expected," Lewis remarked, looking at the batches of high-quality slaves. Bradley smiled slightly. "Market prices are not static, they depend on who the buyer is." The implication was that if someone else had offered 1,500 gold coins, the quality and quantity of slaves they could acquire would be far inferior. But Bradley had merely written a letter, and the slave traders had traveled thousands of miles to personally deliver the highest quality goods to his door. Their attitude was extremely respectful, even proactively lowering prices, all to maintain a long-term partnership with the Calvin family. Was this the power of the Calvin family's old butler? Terrifyingly so. This wasn't just a matter of negotiation skills, but a rule deeply ingrained in the very fabric of society. Lewis secretly rejoiced that he was also a member of the Calvin family. Of course, only by proving one's strength within the family can one truly wield this powerful weapon. If it were him 2 months ago, he probably wouldn't even have had the chance to touch this power. Suddenly, an idea popped into Lewis's mind. How wonderful it would be if one day he could completely control this influence and use the power of the entire Calvin family for his own purposes. Lewis suppressed that fleeting ambition and looked at Bradley. "Thank you for your hard work this time." Bradley nodded slightly, his face still displaying that calm and composed expression. "Serving you is what I should do." Chapter 41: The New Life of Slaves. Groups of slaves, bound by chains and ropes, entered the Red Tide territory under the guidance of slave traders. Their eyes were filled with unease, wondering about their impending fate. However, when they entered the territory, they were stunned. Clean houses, orderly roads, the smell of cooking smoke in the air. This was completely different from the slave camps they remembered. There were no filthy, muddy tents, no rotting food emitting a foul stench. Even the soldiers guarding them didn't show the usual contempt and disdain, but calmly maintained order. They couldn't help but feel even more apprehensive, because the more different it was, the more unsettling it became. But this was only the initial impression. What truly shocked them was the Lord's words in the square the next day. At dawn, the square of the Red Tide territory was bustling with people. 1,500 newly arrived slaves were neatly gathered here. Lewis's voice echoed in the square, "Welcome to the Red Tide territory." A single sentence left many bewildered. They had been sold here, yet they were being welcomed? Lewis continued, "You can treat this place as it always has, but I hope it will be a place of new beginnings for you." The slaves exchanged glances, their eyes still wary. "I won't let you work for nothing. The Red Tide territory will provide stable food, shelter, and work. Your labor will not be wasted, every drop of sweat will have meaning. More importantly," he paused for a moment, then slowly uttered, "here, if you work hard enough, you can escape slavery." Boom! The slaves' hearts jolted, and the square erupted in uproar. What did he just say? How is this possible? Freedom? They still had a chance to gain freedom? Could there really be masters in this world willing to abandon slaves? They had been bought and sold, driven and used, long accustomed to the constraints of chains, no longer daring to hope for a change in their fate. This was a promise that was too beautiful, even absurd. The whispers in the square grew louder, some were excited, some were bewildered. But most sneered, their eyes filled with doubt. They had heard too many lies. Lewis saw all of this, but he believed that time would tell. Several days passed, and the slaves gradually adapted to their new environment. The morning sun shone on the streets of Red Tide territory, bringing a warmth rarely seen in the north. A young slave, holding a steaming bowl of wheat porridge, stood outside a wooden hut, slightly lost in thought. This was his breakfast, a generous portion, more than his entire day's rations used to provide. Nearby, other slaves also emerged from their huts, gathering in twos and threes around braziers for warmth. The beds here are much more comfortable than the straw mats I used to sleep on, an older slave murmured. Yes, another echoed, his expression complex. Here, there was no endless whipping or verbal abuse, there was an ample daily food supply, and the accommodations were like paradise compared to their previous slave camp. What shocked them most was that they had seen free people with their own eyes. Hey, are you a slave? A young slave asked timidly to a craftsman repairing the road. The man stopped hammering, wiped the sweat from his brow, and smiled. It used to be. The young slave's eyes widened. But now, the craftsman grinned. Because I work hard, the Lord gave me the status of a free man. Really? His voice trembled. Of course, the craftsman patted him on the shoulder. As long as you do a good job, the Lord won't mistreat anyone. More and more examples like this appeared. They saw free men in the fields, free men in the blacksmith's shop. Those former slaves now wore decent clothes and lived with their heads held high. The slaves' doubts were shaken at this moment. They began to believe that perhaps freedom wasn't a false promise. As time went by, the slaves' fear gradually faded, replaced by adaptation to the Red Tide territory and a desire for the future. If we're willing to work hard, we can do it too. This idea quietly spread among the slaves, igniting a spark of hope. They no longer merely obeyed passively, but began to truly dedicate themselves to their work. They began to feel genuine gratitude towards the young lord who had given them this opportunity. Whenever he inspected the mines or workshops, the slaves would unconsciously stop what they were doing. Watching him leave, their eyes no longer held only awe, but also an indescribable trust and respect. Of course, the influx of people brought not only labor, but also undeniable challenges. Food wasn't a major problem. Previous reserves and family support ensured ample supplies. However, housing became a thorny issue. The Red Tide territory originally had a small population, and housing construction was based on demand. Now, with the sudden addition of 1,500 slaves, the previously spacious living quarters instantly became cramped. But with a little squeezing, they could manage. The slaves were housed in the existing semi-subterranean longhouses, temporarily sharing living quarters with the original inhabitants. In other places, this situation would likely have sparked discontent or even conflict, but the situation in the Red Tide territory was surprisingly stable. Everyone believed that the Lord had promised to expedite the construction of new houses. Moreover, craftsmen had already begun laying foundations in the outer areas, and new housing was under construction, progressing faster than anyone had anticipated. But Lewis said, "Just bear with it a little longer, there will be more houses soon." So even though the housing was somewhat crowded, the slaves rarely complained privately. The housing shortage was only an immediate problem. What truly worried Lewis was the sanitation issue. One afternoon, Lewis took some time to inspect the newly built residential area. The houses were recently constructed, the wooden beams still smelling of fresh sawdust, and the ground was newly paved dirt roads. From a distance, the rows of houses were orderly, one of the greatest achievements of the Red Tide territory recently. But as Lewis walked deeper into the alley, he sensed something amiss. On both sides of the alley, various piles of garbage could be seen, and a musty smell permeated the air. Especially the oily, brownish-yellow substance glistening in the sunlight at the street corner made Lewis's Adam's apple bob involuntarily. Such an environment might not cause problems in the short term, but with population growth, issues of drinking water, sewage, and environmental sanitation would inevitably become hidden danger sooner or later. If left unchecked, the red tide territory will not have enough doctors to cope with the spread of the disease. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42: Solving Health Problems. Despite the harsh conditions, Lewis was determined not to let sanitation issues jeopardize the future of his territory. First, we need to build toilets, Lewis said, his gaze sweeping over the gathered craftsmen and laborers. We'll add several public toilets to each residential area. Get ready. The craftsmen nodded in agreement, but many still wore expressions of confusion. Building toilets? Wasn't it just digging a pit? Lewis didn't explain much, but instead led his men to select locations. He chose sites far from water sources, away from main roads and residential areas, and downwind. This ensured that drinking water wouldn't be contaminated, nor would it disrupt daily life. A double pit alternating system would be used. Each toilet would have 2 parallel pits, 1 meter apart, each at least 2 meters deep and 0.8 meters wide. The first pit would be sealed and left to ferment into fertilizer after 6 to 12 months before the second pit was used, and so on. To ensure the people truly adhered to the new rules, Lewis even arranged for something special, the creation of illustrations of the 10 Commandments of toileting, which would be hung on the walls of each toilet. Since most were illiterate, he simply had them drawn with simple, straightforward diagrams. For example, there were rules such as no urinating or defecating anywhere, cover the toilet lid after use, and no littering in the toilet. He issued a strict ban. Everyone must use the toilet according to the regulations. Violators will be severely punished. When the new rules were first implemented, many citizens were puzzled. They had been used to relieving themselves anywhere since childhood and had never thought that going to the toilet required rules. But no one dared to object. They might not understand why, but they believed that their lord's words were absolutely correct. Building toilets was only the first step. The next key task was water treatment. Lewis frowned and pointed to the rivers near red tide territory on the map. We can't let everyone fetch water from the river anymore. We need to build a water purification system. He sent people to take samples from several fast-flowing rivers and finally selected the cleanest water source. Here, they built a stepped sand filter, using a 3-layer filtration method to purify the water. The first layer was coarse gravel, which could intercept silt and large particles of impurities. The second layer was fine sand, which could absorb suspended solids in the water, making the water clearer. The most crucial layer was the top layer of birch charcoal fragments, which not only removed odors from the water but also filtered out some bacteria, making the water safer. Lewis watched as the first batch of purified water slowly flowed into the storage tank, so clear that the fine sand at the bottom was almost visible. He scooped up a cup, confirmed there was no odor, and nodded, "Good, this water is drinkable." To ensure water quality, he even specially arranged for several reliable soldiers and stewards to test the water quality daily, reporting any abnormalities immediately. The surrounding residents gathered around to watch, cupping their hands to carefully drink a sip, their faces showing surprise. Sweeter than river water, and without that strange earthy taste. In this way, the residents readily accepted the rule of obtaining drinking water here. With a new water system in operation, the water problem in red tide territory was finally no longer a threat, and the cleanup work had to be thoroughly carried out. Lewis gathered a dozen or so trusted citizens and pointed to the filth. From today onwards, you are the cleaning team. Your job is simply to keep the territory clean. Brooms, buckets, and lime will be provided to you. You must patrol daily, leaving no corner untouched. But these people alone were not enough. Sanitation had to be everyone's responsibility, so he established a general cleaning day. Once a month, everyone in the territory must participate. No one is exempt, whether soldier, civilian, slave, or even knight. The first general cleaning day officially began. As the morning bell rang, the streets of red tide territory teemed with people. Soldiers, civilians, and slaves alike, all armed with brooms, buckets, and shovels, gathered in the square, ready to begin today's cleaning. Although no one said anything, many wore expressions of resistance. But before they even began, a familiar figure had already moved. Lewis picked up a broom and began sweeping away the dust and fallen leaves. The sound of the broom dragging across the ground was clearly audible, particularly loud in the quiet air. Everyone was stunned for a moment. The soldiers' expressions were subtle. They had thought they were just there to maintain order, but they hadn't expected their lord to personally participate. The slaves were even more incredulous. A nobleman doing the same thing as them? But before they could think further, several soldiers reacted first, whispering, "Even the lord is doing it," and then they too lowered their heads and began cleaning. With the soldiers leading the way, the remaining citizens followed suit. The crowd gradually dispersed, and people were cleaning every corner of the main street, alleyways, livestock pens, and market, quickly transforming the previously filthy environment. Louis didn't say a word. He simply focused on his work amidst the crowd. When he looked up, he saw that even those citizens who had initially resisted were now fully engaged in the cleaning. By sunset, the garbage and excrement of Red Tide territory had been completely cleared away, and the air was filled with a fresh scent. Louis's initial series of troubles, building toilets, purifying water sources, digging drainage ditches, and forming cleaning teams, had all contributed to this transformation. Many people thought it was just a passing fancy by the young lord, and that it would soon fizzle out. But as time went on, observant people began to notice something amiss. Huh? Where's the trash on the street? Wait, why doesn't that stench in the alleys go away? Even more surprisingly, the water no longer had the muddy, fishy smell of before. People used to get diarrhea all the time, but now that was almost non-existent. In the past, everyone took the mess and disorder for granted, everyone was used to it. But now, looking back, they realized that a place could truly become so clean and livable. The most obvious change was that fewer people were sick. Unconsciously, the initial complaints about the lord being too demanding disappeared, replaced by a silent acceptance of the new rules. After all, who wouldn't prefer a more comfortable environment? Bradley stood on high ground, overlooking the newly transformed Crimson Tide territory. As the old butler of the Calvin family, he had witnessed the management of territories throughout the empire. Even in core cities like Cloud Tide City, where the Calvin family mansion was located, most neighborhoods weren't as well maintained as this. Interesting, Bradley muttered to himself, his opinion of Louis rising even higher. Chapter 43 The Second Letter from the North. The candlelight flickered, illuminating the letter spread out on the desk. The handwriting was neat and tidy, reflecting the cautious and prudent nature of the old butler, Bradley. Duke Calvin's gaze fell on the beginning of the letter. He only had a slight expectation for this son. But as the text deepened, the Duke's initially nonchalant expression gradually changed, and his brows slowly furrowed. A performance far surpassing other pioneering territories, agricultural breakthroughs, crops ripening ahead of schedule, housing problems solved more efficiently than in established territories. Not only was the magic marrow mine successfully mined, but a scientific mining plan was also developed. Even slave management was optimized to perfection. Especially the part about grain production supporting the addition of 1,500 slaves made him thoughtful. He sat up straighter and glanced at Bradley's signature. If it weren't for the fact that the letter was written by Bradley, the family's most loyal old butler, he would have suspected that the writer had been bribed. But his gaze did not leave the letter, and he continued reading. Duke Calvin quickly realized that Louis's leadership was not only reflected in his policies, but also in his personal charisma. He didn't rely on his family's prestige, but on his own abilities, winning the hearts and minds of everyone in the territory. This was especially evident when Duke Calvin read about the almost fanatical respect the residents of Red Tide territory held for Louis. Fanatical? Is it really that exaggerated? Even the Duke himself had to admit this. In his memory, very few lords in the entire Ironblood Empire could achieve this. He had originally intended for Louis to fend for himself in the north, squeezing out the last bit of value from him. He hadn't expected the kid to actually make a name for himself. His many sons, many blessings plan had indeed been correct, Duke Calvin thought smugly. It was like a lottery, the more you draw, the more prizes you're bound to win. He continued reading, and when he reached the section on the magic marrow mine, Duke Calvin's gaze paused slightly, a hint of interest appearing in his eyes. The sales rights to the magic marrow mine were being transferred to the family in exchange for support, while the processing technology would be retained. This kid's ambition is truly great. He knew what that meant, of course. Louis didn't want to be too constrained by the family. He was trying to maintain his independence. The Duke chuckled coldly, quite bold. However, he wasn't offended. On the contrary, he even found it somewhat interesting. Crimson Tide territory, located in the north, seemed barren and desolate, but with proper management, it could become a powerful local force. Lewis's willingness to hand over the sales rights to the family showed that he understood he still needed the Calvin family's protection. But his refusal to relinquish the processing rights meant he was preparing for the future. Once the time was right, Crimson Tide Territory's magic marrow economy could completely break away from the family, and might even have an independent voice in the future market. A pioneering lord-born into noble family would often choose to completely depend on the family, but Lewis hadn't done so. Of course, this alone wasn't enough to make the Duke look at him differently. Lewis hadn't truly established himself in the north, and the profits from the magic marrow mines hadn't been fully realized. Given the volatile situation in the north, his future remained uncertain. But Lewis had indeed given him an unexpected surprise. He mainly valued Lewis's potential. As for the resources of Crimson Tide Territory, he didn't care. Perhaps it was time to reconsider the value of this son. The Duke held a letter, his fingers lightly tapping the table, his gaze sweeping over the words. Bradley's high praise exceeded his expectations, even giving him a somewhat absurd feeling. But regardless, the facts were undeniable. Lewis, a child he had never taken seriously, had demonstrated abilities far greater than anticipated in the barren lands of the north. Most importantly, the north was simply too far from the southeast provinces. While the Crimson Tide Territory held immense potential, it was too far from the family's core, making full support unrealistic. The Crimson Tide Territory before him was like a seed yet to sprout, full of potential but also fraught with uncertainty. Excessive support could make Lewis impatient and unable to adapt to the harsh environment of the north. Moreover, given Lewis's interest in the magic marrow mine, he seemed unwilling to allow the family too much interference in his territory. The Duke sat at his desk, his gaze once again falling on Bradley's letter. Maintaining the family's influence without excessive interference, he murmured, tapping the table lightly. Financial support was provided, but not in large quantities, so he decided to allocate another 1,000 to 1,500 gold coins. This amount was enough to maintain stability in the Red Tide Territory, but expansion? Lewis would have to find ways to earn money himself, to figure out how to support more people in the territory. He needed to learn to increase revenue and reduce expenditure, instead of relying on family support to get by. Making him short of money, forcing him to use his brain, would reveal his true abilities. Military support was also necessary, so the Duke decided to allocate 2 more night squads to him. Ostensibly to protect the magic marrow mines, this was actually to give him a trump card, preventing him from being crushed as soon as he got started. This number of men wouldn't be enough to carry a large-scale operation in the north, but at least it would prevent the Red Tide Territory from being overthrown by a mere bandit. If Lewis was truly capable, his knights would be enough to stabilize the situation, and he could even develop his own power based on them. But if he couldn't even protect the territory with this amount of family support, then there was nothing more to say, and it wouldn't be worth continuing to invest. As for talent support, Lewis's ability to manage agriculture, infrastructure, and even mine planning already demonstrates his managerial talent. The Duke will only send a few alchemy apprentices to help him master the basic techniques of magic essence extraction, the rest is up to him. He needs to cultivate relationships, use his limited resources to secure cooperation, and learn how to navigate the quagmire of reality, instead of passively waiting for the family to feed him. Regarding political support, he won't provide Lewis with any formal political backing, but he also won't restrict his dealings with northern powers. Whom he chooses to ally with and how he establishes a foothold in the region are entirely up to him. The prerequisite is that he doesn't cause trouble for the family. It's like placing a chess piece on a battlefield to see if it can charge into battle or be used as a stepping stone. If he can't even withstand this pressure, then Lewis is simply incompetent, and dying in the north would be justified. He won't waste resources on a useless child. He has plenty of children anyway, what does it matter if 1 or 2 die? The family bloodline has never been lacking, what it lacks are capable and ambitious individuals. But since Lewis has managed to go this far, and garnered such high praise from Bradley, it proves he has some ability, and perhaps a touch of arrogance. Very well, then let him see what he's really made of. Chapter 44 Bloodstone. After Lewis dealt with the problems caused by the 1,500 slaves, the development of Red Tide Territory went far more smoothly than expected. New houses sprang up rapidly within a month, and wasteland was quickly reclaimed. Hope finally appeared on people's faces. The barren and desolate land was transforming into true territory. Lewis sat in his office, looking at the territory intelligence data compiled by Bradley and nodding in satisfaction. Excellent, the foundation has been laid, it's time to do more important things. It's time to move on to the next plan. Lewis picked up the bloodstone he had brought from the southeast province. It was a deep red crystal, its surface shimmering with an unusual luster, like still flowing blood. This was a special magical ore that could test whether a person had the bloodline of a knight. Only those with knightly blood could make it react. Lewis pricked his fingertip with a dagger, and blood slowly dripped onto the stone. The next second, the bloodstone vibrated slightly, emitting a dark red glow. This indicated that Lewis possessed the aptitude to become a bloodline knight. Of course, this stone could only test the aptitude to become a knight, not the strength of a knight's talent. Lewis wasn't worried about that, because he had a daily intelligence system. If a child showed promise, the system would eventually alert him, allowing for focused training. So, how many children in the Crimson Tide territory possessed the talent to become knights? Lewis planned to use this stone to select children from the Crimson Tide territory, searching for those with the aptitude. He would cultivate true knights of his own bloodline, belonging to the Crimson Tide territory. They wouldn't be knights sent by their families, but loyal knights personally selected, trained, and molded by him. Lewis's knights should be fervent believers. They should trust him unconditionally, follow him, and be loyal to him. Not just pledging allegiance, but regarding him as a true leader, even if faith. Over 200 children, mostly under 15, gathered in the Crimson Tide territory's square. A strange excitement permeated the air, every child held their breath, waiting for something, their heartbeats quickening with anticipation. Their gazes were fixed on Lewis in the center of the square. He wore a black cloak, the Calvin family crest on his chest. Like the sun high in the sky, warm and dazzling. Looking at Lewis, a surge of intense reverence welled up in the hearts of every child. Most were children of refugees and native inhabitants, their parents rescued by Lewis from the brink of starvation. Through the teachings and example of their teachers and parents, they held Lewis in the highest esteem and love. In their hearts, Lewis was like the sun. Today, I will choose some children to become knights, the son announced. As soon as he finished speaking, the square erupted in commotion. Becoming a knight means riding a horse and wielding a sword. Can I protect the Red Tide territory like Lord Lewis? Can I become a knight? The children chattered, their eyes filled with surprise and excitement. These children came from the lower classes and were quite young. They had no idea what the word knight meant. Their understanding was simple and direct. A knight was the closest warrior standing beside a great lord, his protector, a powerful and revered figure in everyone's eyes. To become a knight meant fighting alongside the sun, standing in the most glorious place. Quiet, one at a time, the test officially began. Knights and teachers directed the children to line up, ensuring each child stepped forward in order. Lewis stood on the high platform in the square, the bloodstone on the table before him. The stone's surface shimmered with an eerie light, its deep red luster seemingly dancing, drawing the attention of all the children. One by one, the children stepped forward, following Lewis's instructions, gently pricking their fingers and dripping blood onto the bloodstone. At the start of the test, all the children were excited, anticipating a miracle. However, as most children dripped their blood, the bloodstone remained still, showing no reaction. As time passed, the children's expressions began to show disappointment, and the atmosphere gradually became somewhat subdued. Lewis was also somewhat disappointed, but he didn't show any frustration. After all, such selection was inevitable, only a very few would possess the talent of a knight. A little girl stepped forward and gently dripped her blood onto the stone. Suddenly, the bloodstone glowed faintly, then trembled slightly, emitting a dark red light. In that instant, everyone held their breath, their eyes wide. It's her. She's the future knight, the children whispered excitedly. The little girl stood there, staring blankly at the bloodstone, seemingly not fully understanding what had just happened. Her eyes flickered with confusion and excitement, her legs trembling slightly, unable to comprehend the miracle before her. Lewis gently patted her shoulder. What's your name? The little girl seemed startled, stammering. I'm called Lelia. Congratulations, Lelia, Lewis said, looking at her. You are the first knight trained by the Crimson Tide territory. Hearing this, the little girl's legs went weak, almost unable to support her body, and tears instantly welled up in her eyes. She stood there, stunned, her eyes filled with astonishment, unable to believe that she could become a knight. All the children in the square looked at her, whispering among themselves, their hearts filled with envy. Hearing the envious words of her peers, Lelia finally stood up proudly. Although her legs were still a little weak, the excitement in her heart made her feel as if she were flying. I will become an excellent knight and protect the Crimson Tide territory, Lelia promised Lewis. Listening to the little girl's innocent words, Lewis smiled and said, I look forward to that day. As Lelia successfully passed the Bloodstone test, the atmosphere in the square grew even more excited. Children are always blindly confident, believing they are the one chosen from hundreds, selected to become a knight. However, reality is always cruel. Nearly half the children had stepped forward to test, but only 3 had passed, possessing the talent to become a bloodline knight. Among the crowd was a rather short child, his eyes shining with anticipation, yet also tinged with fear. He longed to become a knight, yet feared he lacked the talent. He wanted to become a knight, to stand beside Lord Lewis, and to repay the Lord's kindness. His name was Will. Chapter 45 Will. Will's story begins 2 years ago, on the day barbarians attacked his village. He was only 10 years old then, a child who knew nothing, and he lost all his relatives and friends, and his former home was reduced to ruins. Only his mother, exhausted, dragged Will into the forest. Without food or water, they could only survive by scavenging fruit. However, their misfortune did not end there. Soon after, they were captured by a group of passing slave traders. His mother tried to help Will escape, but he was eventually taken to the slave market. Will only remember being displayed like a commodity before those cold-blooded buyers. He was dressed in rough cloth, his stomach growled from hunger, and even his most basic dignity was stripped away. His mother held Will tightly, silently enduring all of this. Until fate intervened, the great Lord Lewis appeared at the slave market and bought hundreds of slaves, including himself. Lewis took them to Red Tide territory, giving them a warm home. For the first time, Will ate his fill, wore warm clothes, and felt a long-lost sense of security. His mother began working at the smoked fish workshop in the Red Tide territory. Every morning, she would start her work, washing, marinating, and smoking the fish, never slacking off in any step. Although it was hard work, she survived by her own hands, finally gaining some dignity and stability. And her efforts were not in vain. After hearing about her performance, Lewis decided to revoke his mother and Will's slave status, granting them free citizenship. That day, his mother, who never shed a tear, hugged Will and wept bitterly. From then on, Will also had a goal in life, to become someone who could repay Lord Lewis's kindness. Will stood in the crowd, his eyes fixed on the blood-dripping stone. The opportunity had come. Lord Lewis was selecting knights. If he could be chosen, he could serve the great lord, repaying him for everything he had given his mother and himself. Only then could he stand by Lord Lewis's side, only then could he change his fate. Finally, he was called. Will, the teacher called softly. Will's heart almost leaped out of his chest, he strode heavily towards the platform. The great lord was right in front of him, somewhat dazzling. Following the rules, he gently pricked his finger with a dagger, letting the blood drip onto the bloodstone. It must succeed, he kept chanting to himself, almost breathless. The instant the blood touched the bloodstone, a subtle reaction seemed to occur. The stone's surface glowed faintly, flashing a red light. Will's eyes widened, almost unable to believe his eyes. It worked, he murmured, tears welling in his eyes. He instinctively knelt down, his knees touching the ground. I really succeeded, great lord, I pledge my allegiance to you. Lewis gently helped him up. No need to be so excited. Will's voice trembled slightly. Thank you, sir. I will do everything in my power to protect the Crimson Tide territory. Lewis had long known that Will possessed the potential to become a top-tier knight. Even when Will was still a slave, the daily intelligence system had already alerted him. Will was a knight candidate with extraordinary talent. Becoming a top-tier knight would make him a top-tier fighting force for the Crimson Tide territory in the future. The tests lasted all morning, with over 200 children participating. Ultimately, 8 were selected, deemed to possess the talent to become knights. 8 knights, Lewis murmured softly, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. While this result wasn't large, it was a considerable achievement for a newly established territory. In fact, training knights required substantial resources. Although resources were scarce in Red Tide territory, the support of his family allowed him to afford it. The minor nobles in the south, who had accumulated wealth over several generations, likely only had a few dozen apprentice knights, a dozen or so full-fledged knights, plus a few elite knights. Compared to these minor nobles, with family support, Louis's military strength was now comparable. The only problem was that Red Tide territory was located in the north, a land that was not only desolate but also dangerous. Barbarians, bandits, and even other surrounding lords were all potential threats. For example, according to the daily intelligence system, the Snowsworn had recently been frequently harassing the northern provinces, acting as if they were on a rampage. Fortunately, they were relatively far away. To survive in this environment, Louis had to be even more cautious, relying on his own troops and resources to gradually establish a foothold. Louis stood high on the training ground, looking at the 8 children. These children would not only be the future knights of the Crimson Tide territory, but also his closest force, his future personal guard. Louis entrusted these 8 exceptionally talented children to Barnes, a formal knight. Barnes possessed rich combat experience and teaching abilities, making him the best candidate to train these future knights. Their first lesson was practicing breathing techniques. Breathing techniques are the foundation of knightly training, determining how far you can go. Barnes demonstrated how to use the breath flow breathing technique, a skill originating from the Calvin family. Although not as powerful as the tidal breathing technique, which only the family's core members could practice, it was still strong enough to be considered a first-class breathing technique. There are 7 energy nodes in the human body. By practicing breathing techniques to activate them, you can convert the energy in the air into battle ki, which enters the body and activates the bloodline, Barnes explained while demonstrating the breathing movements, taking a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slightly, and then slowly exhaling. Every deep breath is an absorption of energy from the atmosphere. This energy will eventually transform into your fighting spirit. The children earnestly imitated Barnes's movements, trying to feel the changes within their bodies. At first, the children didn't feel anything, but as time went on, some children finally noticed subtle changes within their bodies. Will was the first to feel it, and he whispered, I feel energy entering my body." Barnes nodded with satisfaction. "Very good, this is the first step." In the following training, Barnes required the children to continue practicing, constantly deepening their understanding of breathing techniques. He emphasized, breathing techniques are not only a means to increase fighting spirit, but also a process of tempering your spirit and will. At the end of several days of training, the children could all feel the changes in the airflow within their bodies, and had initially grasped the core of the breath flow technique. Barnes expressed his satisfaction with their performance. "You have taken the first step towards becoming knights. This is just the beginning. Only by continuously honing these children can truly loyal and capable knights be cultivated for the Crimson Tide territory." Chapter 46 Annihilation of the Snowsworn. Louis woke up and habitually opened the daily intelligence system. Lately, the daily intelligence reports hadn't been very useful. He needed some good intelligence from the great system. Daily intelligence update complete. 1. Due to the Snowsworn's increasingly rampant activities, Duke Edmund has decided to summon his vassals to wipe them out in one fell swoop. 2. Knight trainee Wheel has activated his bloodline and officially become a novice knight. 3. A group of ice armor bearers will pass through the northern part of Red Tide territory tomorrow afternoon. Louis's gaze swept across the intelligence screen. Today's updates seemed quite useful. The first report immediately caught his attention. Duke Edmund had decided to wipe out the Snowsworn. This news pleased Louis somewhat, but also filled him with a vague sense of unease. The Snowsworn, as the largest and most terrifying rebel organization in the north, was becoming increasingly rampant. Recently, they had not only attacked several small territories but also kidnapped nobles and knights, conducting horrific and evil sacrificial rituals. Although these rites were still some distance from Red Tide territory, what if their tentacles reached there? The sheer size and ruthless methods of the Snowsworn organization worried Louis. His own forces were simply insufficient to deal with such a rebellious organization. Duke Edmund's intervention, aiming to wipe them out in one fell swoop, was undoubtedly a boon to the north. However, his gaze darkened again. According to the Northern Frontier Territory, he was nominally Duke Edmund's vassal, or rather, the entire north was his vassal. "I must answer the call," Louis murmured to himself. The situation in the north was turbulent, and as a vassal, he had to respond to the Duke's call to quell the rebellion. The Red Tide territory had only recently stabilized, and his forces were still weak. A campaign to quell the rebellion would inevitably result in losses. But Louis suddenly remembered something. He had a daily intelligence system. This powerful tool had already allowed him to survive many crises. Through the system, Lewis could anticipate potential threats on the battlefield, avoiding direct conflict. It could even allow the Red Tide territory to seize the opportunity to gain more resources from the turmoil and enhance its strength. When soldiers come, we'll block them. When water comes, we'll dam it. Thinking this way, he felt much more relaxed. Lewis continued reading the intelligence, his eyes landing on the second update. Will has officially become a trainee knight. Activating his bloodline, he paused slightly, then a hint of admiration flashed in his eyes. With the help of the daily intelligence system, he had already foreseen this moment. Moreover, Will's future was not just that of a simple trainee knight, he would be one of the strongest forces in the Crimson Tide territory. Truly worthy of being a future pinnacle knight, Lewis couldn't help but sigh, nodding with satisfaction. He then looked at the third intelligence report. The ice armor bear has awakened from hibernation and is expected to pass through the northern part of the Crimson Tide territory tomorrow afternoon. Adult ice armor bears are extremely dangerous magical creatures. Standing at a height of 7.2 meters, their skin is covered with a layer of natural ice crystals, making them virtually impervious to any attack. Their forepaws have evolved half-meter-long icy iron claws, which can release low-temperature pulses when hunting, instantly freezing the blood of their prey. Lewis's face showed no worry, but rather a faint smile. This is actually a good thing for me, he murmured to himself. Although the ice armor bear is powerful and ferocious, it is not a significant threat to his current combat strength. Moreover, its meat is extremely valuable, capable of enhancing a knight's flesh and blood and battle aura. This was the perfect reward for his knights and the 8 knightly trainees. Furthermore, these knights hadn't seen combat in a long time, and the presence of the ice armor bear would ignite their fighting spirit and training enthusiasm. He immediately summoned Lambert. Lambert, gather all knights and archers, prepare to depart for the north hunting. Lambert didn't ask any questions, responded, and quickly went to arrange the relevant matters. An urgent report flew swiftly to Duke Edmund's study. Report: a territory in the north has been attacked by the Snowsworn. All civilians have been killed, and nobles and knights have been abducted. These few lines were like a huge bomb, instantly exploding in the Duke's heart. This was the 6th similar incident in the past 2 months. The Snowsworn's atrocities were becoming increasingly rampant, and every inch of the north trembled with unease. Damn the Snowsworn! Duke Edmund abruptly stood up, sweeping documents off the table. The Snowsworn had once been a surviving force of the Snow Kingdom, but with the Empire's conquests, they had gradually transformed into outlaws. At this moment, this organization, already deeply mired in hatred, was igniting the flames of revenge across the northern lands. These are no longer bandits, we must strike hard. The Duke's heart burned with rage. This threat had to be completely eradicated for the north to regain its peace. Even if they couldn't be completely wiped out, their hands must be severed, so they would never dare to plunder freely within the territory again. That evening, the Duke summoned senior members of the family, strategists, advisors, and key generals for an emergency meeting. We can't wait any longer. Dispatch all vassals, assemble the army, and divide forces to surround the Snowsworn's stronghold. We must annihilate them in one fell swoop. Under the Duke's instructions, all family members began to discuss in detail how to deal with this storm. The meeting entered a tense strategic discussion phase, and the strategists began to formulate specific battle plans. We will divide our forces to encircle and annihilate the Snowsworn strongholds, leaving no stone unturned. At the same time, we will heavily guard the border to prevent the northern tribes from taking advantage of the situation, the Duke instructed. Notify all vassals to assemble and prepare for the attack. They must depart on time. As the meeting drew to a close, a strategist asked, Duke, should we also include those newly arrived southern settlers in this operation? Duke Edmund sneered, his eyes filled with disdain. All of them. Southern settlers? These are nothing but useless noble scions. Anyway, the bigwigs in the south won't care if they die. We'll send them all to their deaths. His tone was contemptuous, his attitude towards the southern settlers obvious. Originally, the Emperor's northern expansion decree ordered southern nobles to send their disciples to expand the northern territory, using their strength to stabilize the north. However, those imperial vampires only sent some scraps to appease the Emperor. Since that's the case, this expedition will also serve to eliminate these useless troubles. After the meeting, the Duke immediately began implementing the plan. The knights sprang into action, relaying orders to every vassal to ensure all troops could assemble on time. The entire north, like a slumbering beast, began to slowly awaken, preparing for the impending bloody battle. Duke Edmund stood atop the towers of Frostspire, coldly surveying the land about to be consumed by flames. Chapter 47 Hunting the Ice Armor Bear Pack. Lewis stood atop the mountain peak, overlooking the herd of ice-armored bears below. Sunlight shone on their grayish-white ice armor, the hexagonal ice crystal scales reflecting a blinding light. Their forepaws were adorned with sharp, cold iron claws, and the ice armor on their backs occasionally flashed with blue flames as they moved. These ice-armored bears were enormous, each low growl like thunder shaking the earth. But no matter how you looked at them, these behemoths possessed not a trace of cuteness. On the contrary, they were extremely ferocious beings. They darted across the snow, searching for prey. Beside Lewis stood two children, Lelia and Will. They were the only two children among the 8 candidate knights to have activated their bloodlines and become apprentice knights. Today, Lewis had decided to bring them to witness this hunt firsthand, to rescue them from the monotony of their daily training, as a reward for their efforts. Lelia's eyes gleamed with excitement as she gripped a longsword, almost longer than herself, mimicking the posture of an adult knight. Not to be outdone, Will adjusted his equipment, then immediately straightened his back, trying to look like a true knight. "You two stay by my side and protect me," Lewis said in a low voice. He was actually afraid that the two little devils might get excited and rush down to fight the ice armor bears to the death. Protecting the Lord. Such an important mission. Lelia and Will straightened their backs even more, nodding nervously and excitedly. Once everything was ready, Lewis waved his hand. "Ready, bear killing plan begins." With a command given, the commander in the distance waved his banner, ordering the knights and hunters to move silently from their various ambushed points. The hunters quietly approached the ice armor bears' territory and gently scattered the urine of mating female bears. This special scent quickly attracted the ice armor bears, especially the males, who were extremely sensitive to it. As the urine was scattered, the bear pack slowly gathered, and the 9 ice armor bears gradually assembled in one place, heading towards the canyon. Meanwhile, another group of hunters hid on a distant ridge, creating the sound of rolling rocks, successfully guiding the bear pack into the designated canyon. They've entered the canyon. Everyone proceed according to plan, the commander signaled, waving his flag. In the canyon's low-lying area, a row of sharp wooden stakes had been carefully laid out underground. Guided by the hunters, as the armored bears entered the canyon, the stakes pierced the paws of several lead bears like venomous snakes, as their paws lacked thick armor. Intense pain quickly spread throughout their bodies, and the armored bears growled, trying to pull out the deeply embedded stakes. But their massive size and excessive strength prevented them from immediately freeing themselves. The remaining armored bears were also trapped in the same predicament, and the entire group began to fall into chaos. Then, the hunters ignited the resin and oil accumulated on the rock face, and flames instantly engulfed the mountainside. With a roar, a fireball rolled down the cliff edge, landing precisely in the center of the bear pack. The explosion and flames spread together, instantly consuming the few armored bears trapped by the stakes. Although the intense heat of the flames ignited the armored bears' fur, their thick armor did not immediately crumble under the heat. The burn marks left on the ice armor bears' hard scales were not fatal. The pain from the scorching flames only fueled the bears' chaos and ferocity. They huddled together, jostling and colliding. Their eyes and necks were now exposed, but the thick ice armor made them difficult to penetrate with ordinary arrows. Archers hidden in the canyon began firing fire arrows at the bears. The attack was minimal, not intended to penetrate, but to wear down the bears' stamina and endurance. The arrows struck the bears' bodies, flames spreading along their thick shells. While unable to tear the armor, the continuous burning drained their strength, noticeably slowing the pack. Though still powerful, their thick ice armor was cracked, some areas even melting under the intense heat, revealing the tough but no longer impenetrable skin beneath. At that moment, the knights lying in ambush moved. Now, the commander's flag slammed down. The knights raised their long swords and lances, gathering their battle aura, the blades blazing with a crimson light. The crimson ore flowed along their weapons, its slight vibrations even distorting the air. Charge! The knights' steeds leaped forward, their targets clear, the ice-armored bears' joints, jaws, throats, and eyes, their weak points. Archers had already significantly weakened the defenses in these areas, and the knights' task was to end their lives. An elite knight brandished his lance, battle ore condensing into a blazing light at the blade. He aimed at a smaller ice-armored bear, whose throat had already been pierced by an arrow. The knight's eyes were like an eagle's, his steed galloping through the wind. Battle aura burned on the lance's blade, and he plunged it fiercely into the crack. PFFT, the spear pierced directly into the crack in the ice armor bear's shell. Blood mingled with red battle aura, like molten lava surging into the bear's body, burning its flesh. The ice armor bear let out a deafening roar, its massive body trembling in agony, nearly collapsing. Watching from the sidelines, Will's eyes gleamed with excitement as he jumped up. "We defeated one. The knights are truly strong, don't be too happy yet, Will." Lewis's voice was calm. "This is only the first stage." Will paused, somewhat confused. Wasn't the ice armor bear about to fall? Just then, the swaying ice armor bear roared back. Violent cracks began to appear on its hard shell, and streaks of icy flame unfurled from its demonic wings, rapidly spreading into the air with a chilling aura. The icy flames quickly contacted the air, unleashing a powerful culling explosion. "Retreat!" The commander hurriedly waved his flag. The chilling power swept through the surroundings, and several knights, before they could react, were engulfed by the icy flames. Fortunately, protected by battle aura, they didn't lose their mobility and quickly retreated. However, the ice armor bear's attack didn't stop there. As the ice armor bear fully activated its berserk state, 3 enormous crystalline spikes rose from its back. The crystalline spikes continuously released shockwaves carrying extremely high energy. Heat waves and explosions intertwined, almost rendering the surrounding knights unable to fight. The surrounding air seemed to become heavy, and each violent tremor made it difficult to breathe. Chapter 48: A Treasure Trove. Will watched the situation nervously, worried for the knights in battle. The ice armor bear was now completely enraged, its surroundings seemingly frozen in its fury. 3 enormous crystalline spikes rose from its back, radiating a blazing blue light. The air distorted by the intense heat, violently vibrating, making it difficult for the surrounding knights to stand. The archer's arrows could no longer reach the ice armor bear's skin. The icy flames in the air would vaporize them instantly. "Phase 2 operations," Lewis shouted. The commander waved his flag, signaling the attack. The knights quickly split into several groups, circling the ice armor bear. They moved swiftly out of its sight, each provocation fueling its rage. Its hexagonal eyes flashed with furious red light, and icy flames leaked from its body. "Continue to lure them in, don't let them get close," Lambert, the on-site commander, shouted. Each time they approached, the knights quickly turned, skillfully avoiding the ice armor bear's attacks. It swung its massive claws frantically, but no matter what it did, it missed. A helpless roar ripped through the silence of the mountains. The crystal spikes released increasingly powerful heat waves, and deafening energy fluctuations filled the air. "Their energy is about to explode," Lelia shouted, her eyes filled with worry. "Be patient, don't let them stop." Lewis stared at the ice armor bear, observing the crystals behind it. At this moment, any detail could determine victory or defeat. The knights' movements became increasingly precise, each provocation further fueling the ice armor bear's berserk energy. The continuous implementation of the kiting tactic drove each of the 9 ice armor bears to their limits, going berserk. Their internal energy began to overflow uncontrollably, the furious currents nearly toppling the surrounding trees and rocks. Rocks began to tumble, the distant mountains trembling. Now, Lambert's eyes lit up. He saw that fleeting opportunity. Lambert led 6 elite knights and 23 regular knights, quickly separating and swiftly attacking each berserk ice armor bear. Each ice armor bear desperately unleashed powerful cold flames, violent currents sweeping across the surroundings. Temperatures soared, a deadly barrier formed by the interplay of cold winds and heat waves. Lambert gripped his longsword, leading his men in a charge, their target clear, the cores of the berserk ice armor bears. Thud! The longsword pierced the core of one of the berserk ice armor bears. Simultaneously, the other knights retaliated, quickly concentrating their attacks in waves. With each assault, the crystalline spikes on the ice armor bears' backs flashed wildly, vibrating violently, unleashing a torrent of powerful energy. A powerful shockwave exploded, nearly tearing the battlefield apart. A massive storm of cold flames swept everything in its path. "Retreat! Retreat quickly!" Lambert's voice was almost drowned out by the deafening roar of the explosion. The knights retreated swiftly, dodging the uncontrollable explosive energy. Smoke filled the battlefield, flames scattering everywhere. The energy bursts from the 9 ice armor bears created a terrifying catastrophe, the explosions distorting the air. Ice crystal shells shattered in the flames, fragments flying everywhere. When the smoke cleared, in the center of this chaotic battlefield, the surviving corpses of the 9 ice armor bears lay silently. Although the explosive force of their berserk state was enough to tear everything apart, thanks to the ice armor bears' icy shells, their corpses did not turn to ash. Their crystalline spikes remained hard, and although some were shattered, their powerful threat was still palpable. It was over. Lewis stood on one side of the battlefield, his gaze sweeping across, finally letting out a sigh of relief. Although it had been a fierce battle, not a single member of his troops was injured, not even their war horses were unharmed. Will and Lelia stood to the side, their eyes gleaming with longing. They looked at the knights on the battlefield, dreaming of one day being like them, able to stand on the battlefield and slay these powerful enemies for Lord Lewis. "We can do it too, right?" Lelia asked softly. Will didn't speak, only nodded vigorously. With the battle over, the knights began methodically collecting the spoils. These behemoths that had once instilled fear in everyone now lay quietly on the ground, spoils of war. And each ice armor bear was practically a treasure trove. The knights carefully cut off pieces of bear meat, firm yet elastic, emitting a unique aroma. Ice-armored bear meat was considered a nourishing delicacy, fetching a high price in the south. It effectively strengthened a knight's flesh and blood, increasing their battle ore reserves. Each piece provided a significant boost to the knights. Some knights even specialized in dismantling the crystals from the ice-armored bear's back. These crystals, in the hands of alchemists, could be crafted into powerful potions or magical items, priceless in the market. Lewis looked at the ice-armored bear carcass, a hint of regret in his eyes. If ice-armored bears weren't so dangerous and unstable, he would have long ago opened his own ice-armored bear farm. Every inch of these behemoths was worth utilizing. Bear meat, crystals, ice armor, even bear claws and teeth had extremely high value, a veritable natural resource pool. But it was just a dream. If he actually raised them, the Crimson Tide territory would probably be blown to bits in a couple of days. He glanced at the busy knights, looking at the spoils, and couldn't help but smile. This was indeed a great victory, so he prepared to reward the knights. "All right, everyone stop," he shouted. The knights stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Lewis. "I've decided to use the meat from these ice-armored bears tonight to hold a feast," Lewis announced. As soon as he finished speaking, the surrounding knights cheered. The tense atmosphere after the battle was instantly swept away. "Lord Lewis, this is too generous," one knight shouted first. "Yes. This bear meat is precious, a true blessing for warriors," another knight's eyes gleamed. The surrounding knights raised their hands and shouted in unison, "Praise be to our great lord." Lewis listened to the cheers around him, feeling very satisfied. After all, these knights weren't his own trainers, only by investing sufficient resources could they truly be loyal to him. With a sufficient reward, a knight could easily wield 6 swords in a second. Moreover, with danger imminent, the meat from these ice-armored bears would provide his troops with extra strength, giving him more confidence to face the upcoming bandit suppression challenge. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49 Barbecue Feast. As Lewis rode back to his territory with his prey, dusk was falling. The battle he had just fought was still exhilarating, and today's good news only added to the excitement. Back at his quarters, he received his father, Duke Calvin's, second installment of funding. "My lord, your father has replied," Bradley respectfully handed Lewis the letter. Lewis opened the envelope and began to read quickly. Duke Calvin had provided him with 6 elite knights, 20 full-fledged knights, and 60 apprentice knights. This nearly doubled his military strength. Besides the knights, the letter also mentioned 3 alchemy apprentices. Though few in number, they were enough for him to establish a stable magic marrow extraction technology. What surprised him most was that his father had agreed to his proposal for magic marrow mining and processing. He even promised to entrust all the work of the project to the Crimson Tide territory, with the family only responsible for sales. This ensured his autonomy over the project. Essentially, Lewis was selling the finished magic marrow to the Calvin family, who would then distribute it. The letter ended with a subtle reminder: "You will always be a member of the Calvin family." Though not explicitly stated, the underlying threat made Lewis's heart tighten slightly. He understood this was a warning against overthinking. Lewis put down the letter, stretched, and yawned, in high spirits. Today is truly a double celebration. Inside the banquet tent, the atmosphere was lively. Lewis sat in the main seat, a plate of golden brown roasted ice-armored bear meat before him. This time, Lewis hadn't invited ordinary citizens to the barbecue feast. After all, ice-armored bear meat was extremely precious. This feast was mainly for the knights. Besides Lewis and his existing knights, the banquet also included new knights recently brought from the family and 8 reserve knights. It was both a celebration of the successful hunt and a welcome party for the newly joined knights. Plates of roasted meat were brought to the table, emitting a fragrant aroma. Each piece of ice-armored bear meat was roasted perfectly, slightly charred on the surface, tender and juicy. One for each person, the old butler Bradley directed from the side. The servants deftly distributed the roasted meat to each knight. The atmosphere of the banquet immediately became lively, especially among the newly arrived knights, who hadn't yet adapted to the cold and desolation of this land. They never expected to enjoy such a precious delicacy upon arriving in Crimson Tide territory. This is ice armor bear meat. It's nourishing and strengthens the body, enhancing battle aura, Bradley explained to the new knights. This is ice armor bear meat. A young knight's eyes nearly popped out of his head. The rarity of ice armor bear meat was self-evident. In the south, only a very few nobles had the opportunity to taste this level of magical beast meat. They're actually giving us ice armor bear meat. This is incredibly luxurious. The new knight's eyes were filled with amazement. I only eat ordinary magical beast meat once or twice a year at most. I never expected to taste such top-quality magical beast meat so soon. Another young knight couldn't help but mutter under his breath. In the south, even the great nobles only have the opportunity to eat this kind of high-grade magical beast meat at important banquets. Ordinary knights wouldn't even dare to touch such good meat. Is this the treatment in the north? A new knight asked in a low voice. The old knight beside him, upon hearing this, dismissively said to Versailles, "Actually, we don't often see such top-quality magical beast meat here, but we can eat ordinary magical beast meat once a month." Don't make a fuss. The new knights were even more astonished. Eating ordinary magical beast meat once a month. What a generous lord. Looks like I've come to the right place, the new knights thought to themselves. They had arrived in the north with some resentment, thinking they were here to suffer, but it turned out they were here to enjoy a life of luxury. Their complaints vanished, replaced by loyalty to the generous Lord Lewis. Lewis stood in the center of the banquet, raising his glass. Everyone has worked hard. Today's banquet is not only to celebrate our victory, but also to celebrate the addition of many new members. Everyone's efforts are indispensable. From the hunting grounds to the battlefield, we will face many hardships together, and we will also share the fruits of victory. Remember, whenever I have a bite to eat, everyone has a bite to eat. The knights raised their glasses in enthusiastic response, shouting, "Long live the Lord! Long live the Lord!" Their eyes were filled with admiration and gratitude for Lewis. Wer was also at the banquet, sitting among a group of knights, his face beaming with excitement. Being a member of the Crimson Tide Knights made him incredibly proud. The atmosphere of the banquet was lively. After everyone had praised the Lord, the most anticipated part was eating meat. He carefully picked up his knife and fork and put the roasted meat from the ice armor bear into his mouth. The roasted meat was crispy on the outside and tender on the inside, juicy and flavorful. The moment it entered his mouth, a warm current spread from his stomach, quickly flowing into his limbs and bones. Will's eyes widened as he felt his blood and ki rapidly surging, an unprecedented power welling up within him. He quickly put down his knife and fork, sat cross-legged, and began practicing breathing exercises to guide the warm current through his body. The warm energy coursed through his meridians, and he could clearly feel his body being gradually strengthened, his blood and ki becoming increasingly abundant, as if his bones had been forged anew. A moment later, his blood and ki finally broke through the critical point. He had broken through. Intermediate apprentice knight. Barnes, Will's instructor beside him, stared wide-eyed in shock. Looking at Will, he couldn't help but mutter to himself, Will only broke through to become an apprentice knight yesterday? His talent is actually so powerful. Will's breakthrough attracted the attention of those around him, but he wasn't the only one. During the banquet, one knight after another began to feel their blood and ki surging, a powerful energy forcing them to sit cross-legged and practice breathing exercises. The noise gradually subsided, replaced by the deep breathing of each knight, and the entire banquet hall suddenly became unusually quiet. A subtle atmosphere filled the air as everyone focused intently on channeling their inner power, their bodies continuously strengthening. A few minutes later, a sudden cheer shattered the silence. Several knights had broken through. The knights congratulated each other, naturally praising their lord's generosity. Following Lord Calvin, we have no worries about food or clothing, and we even have precious magical beast meat to eat. So loyal, we can never repay the Lord's kindness. It is truly our honor to follow you, sir. Lewis couldn't help but marvel at how the banquet had far exceeded his expectations. Chapter 50 Demonic Marrow Manufacturing Plant. With the day of the bandit suppression drawing ever closer, Lewis, accompanied by several knights carrying 2 heavy crates, headed straight for the magic marrow manufacturing plant, also known as the Alchemy Workshop, near the mining area. This plant was built by Hilko and 3 newly arrived alchemy apprentices. Calling it a factory was a stretch. It was really just a few simple sheds, with alchemy equipment transported from the southeastern province scattered around. Though rudimentary, the conditions were sufficient to establish a basic framework for magic marrow extraction. "Lord, you've come at the right time," Hilko said lazily, leaning against a wooden pillar. With more people in the Crimson Tide territory now, he wasn't as busy and looked a little more energetic than before, though still somewhat languid. "The first batch of magic marrow has just been refined." Hearing this, Lewis's interest was piqued, his gaze falling on a heavy wooden barrel. The barrel was filled with a deep purple powder, its surface shimmering slightly, appearing delicate and smooth, faintly radiating magical energy. Lewis reached out and grabbed the small amount, feeling an extremely smooth texture on his fingertips. He couldn't help but exclaim, "This is magic marrow." "That's right." Hilko patted the barrel. "This barrel is worth at least 50 gold coins on the market." Lewis's expression shifted slightly. 50 gold coins was no small sum. It was enough to buy 100 slaves or support 2 full-fledged knights for a year. And this was just the result of a small-scale trial. Thinking of the vast magic marrow mine in his territory, Lewis's excitement grew. But at the same time, he knew that many difficulties still needed to be overcome before large-scale production could be achieved. Mining magic marrow was inherently risky. A slight mistake could cause a collapse. Moreover, their equipment and manpower were far from sufficient. This barrel of magic marrow represented the entire output of the past week. "Well done." Lewis immediately took out 20 gold coins and handed them to Hilko, then gave each of the 3 alchemy apprentices 10 gold coins. The apprentices were stunned for a moment when they received the coins, then their faces lit up with excitement. This was a huge sum for them, and they all expressed their gratitude to Lewis. "Thank you, Lord," but after a moment, one of the apprentices muttered softly, "But where can we spend our gold coins here?" The others around him were silent for a moment, then couldn't help but chuckle. After laughing, Lewis turned to Hilko and got down to business. He patted the wooden barrel and asked directly, "Hilko, can this be used to make demon flame bullets?" Upon hearing this question, Hilko frowned slightly, thought for a moment, and then answered, "The key materials for demon flame bullets are not only magic marrow, but also materials such as igniting cores. And Crimson Tide territory currently has none of these materials." "I see." Lewis then coughed lightly, gesturing for the knights behind him to open the 2 heavy chests they had brought. The lids of the wooden chests were lifted, and a rich magical aura rushed out. The chests were filled with a deep blue crystal. These were the crystalline spikes taken from the ice armor bear's body, containing extremely strong energy fluctuations. Hilko and the 3 alchemy apprentices were stunned, their eyes wide open, and their breathing became rapid. This is top-grade alchemy material," an apprentice exclaimed excitedly. "If used properly, it's enough to make high-level magical items." Hilko snapped out of his daze and asked uncertainly, "You mean?" Lewis patted the box, with this added, "Can we make a magic flame bullet?" Hilko paused, then nodded blankly. But the next second, he shook his head violently, an incredulous expression on his face. No, this is too wasteful. Magic marrow is precious enough already, and now ice armor bear crystal. Using these 2 top-tier materials to make magic flame bullets, this is simply a waste. If these materials were used in weapons, armor, or magical items, their value would far exceed that of ordinary magic flame bullets. Lewis waved his hand dismissively, saying, "If you can make it, that's fine. Make it as soon as possible. I need it urgently." Hilko sighed, "Since the Lord has said so, we will finish it as soon as possible. I need it by the day after tomorrow at the latest," Lewis said, drawing a deadline. Hilko's lips twitched, as if he wanted to say something more, but in the end he just shrugged helplessly and waved for the alchemy apprentices to begin their research immediately. Lewis stood aside, watching the alchemy apprentice's busy figures with great interest. Just as an apprentice was carefully pouring deep purple magic powder into an alchemy bottle, the sound of rapid hoofbeats suddenly came from outside. "My lord," a knight rode in at full speed, dismounted, and knelt on one knee. "Duke Edmund's messenger has arrived and is waiting at the gate of the territory." Lewis sighed. "He's come after all." He turned and straightened his cloak, nodding to the knight. "Take me there." Outside the council hall of the Crimson Tide territory, a knight wearing a dark blue cloak was waiting. He was a full-fledged knight, his armor engraved with the insignia of Duke Edmund's family, clearly not an ordinary attendant or messenger. Upon seeing Lewis's arrival, the knight immediately knelt on one knee, reiterating Duke Edmund's words with a firm tone. "Lord Lewis Calvin, His Excellency Duke Edmund has ordered the summoning of all lords in the north to immediately muster their armies and launch an attack to annihilate the now sworn rebels." With that, he drew a letter bearing the Duke's seal from his waist and presented it with both hands. Lewis took the envelope, opened it, and quickly scanned its contents. The letter was extremely stern, clearly specifying the summons time and ordering all northern lords to personally lead their troops to the assembly point. Each lord was required to send at least a certain number of soldiers. Any delay or disobedience would be considered treason. At the end of the letter, it was specifically stated that Lewis's assembly point was Snowick City. Snowick City was an important military fortress in the north and also the territory of Earl Rivers. Earl Rivers was also the governor of Snowpeak County, responsible for governing all the smaller territories within Snowpeak County. Red Tide Territory was nominally one of his territories. However, due to the tax exemption enjoyed by the pioneering lords, and the sheer vastness of the north, Lewis had yet to formally interact with the count. Lewis closed the letter, looked up at the messenger, and said, "I will proceed to the assembly point on time." The knight bowed, then immediately turned and rode off towards the next territory. Only after the knight's figure disappeared into the distance did Lewis lower his head again, carefully rereading the letter and calculating the time. There were still a few days to prepare before the official departure. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.